So around a month ago I released a video ranking all Soulsborne bosses from worst to best, but that was before the DLC. Look, I know I should have did this after the DLC came out, but the reason why I dropped it before is kind of a long story. So this video is basically a remastered of that one, but now I've included the main DLC bosses in it as well. So without wasting any more of your time, let's get right into the video. So today I decided to challenge myself and rank every single Souls boss from the absolute worst to the absolute best, all in one video, not as a tier list but an actual in-depth video. This is honestly the longest, most time-consuming video I've ever made, and if you'd like to show support, give this video a like and also check out my Patreon and Discord. I'll talk more about the Patreon at the end of the video. So what are the conditions for this? Well, I'm ranking every single Souls boss from Demon Souls all the way up to Elden Ring, and this includes most of the mini bosses as well. Now to be completely honest, bosses from the Chalice dungeons and certain mini bosses from Elden Ring won't make it on the list, because most of the Chalice dungeon boss fights are rather boring and some are just reskins, while in Elden Ring's case, some mini bosses are just regular enemies that were given a boss health bar. Don't get me wrong though, there are going to be tons of actual cool or important mini bosses that shows up on the list, mostly the ones I've encountered. Now I did say that this won't be your typical tier list video, but I'm going to be ranking the bosses in different tiers, starting from F all the way up to S. One final thing before I get into the list, this is just my opinion. Not because I say a boss is better than the other doesn't mean that you should automatically change your mind and agree, unless of course you already agreed with it before. But without wasting any more of your time, let's get right into the list. And at the very last place at the very bottom of F tier we have the Bed of Chaos. This piece of dog shit deserves this spot for a reason. I've never hated a boss fight more than the Bed of Chaos. Everything about it sucks. The arena is bland and boring, the boss moveset is also lackluster and annoying as hell to deal with, especially with the sweep attacks. The arena also crumbles, which can lead you to fall off pretty easily, and let's not forget the worst part, the platforming jump you need to make in order to get to the center of the tree. I literally had to change my jump input because for some reason every time I press L3 to jump, my character will just jump towards the left, and I think it's because the movement in Dark Souls 1 is a bit more sensitive, but that aside, making the jump safely is the worst part of the fight, especially since the boss will do an arm sweep every second. Overall, genuinely the worst boss fight in Soulsborne history, and difficulty wise I would give it a 10 out of 10, but for all the bad reasons. Look, I don't want to talk about this anymore. Moving on. Next up we have Mikolash, Host of the Nightmare, the second worst boss in Souls history. Now the reason why this goof gets this spot is because 90% of the time you're chasing him, and on your first encounter it's kinda hard to tell that there's a pattern to his run, but chasing him isn't just the bad part. Fighting him is also lackluster and underwhelming. I mean, in his first phase all he does is stand around and spam the tentacle attack over and over and over again while his puppets attack you. But the real worst part is the second phase where he just runs away from you again, and then you have to chase him into this room and fight him, but this time he has more attacks in his arsenal, and one of them being this annoying ass attack called A Call Beyond that can literally one-shot you. Dodging this attack isn't super clear as most of the time you'll try to dodge sideways or behind and that would just get you killed. Overall, the difficulty on this boss gets a 9, and in terms of overall rating and enjoyment, well, he's in F tier for a reason. Next up for F tier we have the Witches of Hemwick. This boss ranks super low due to how lackluster the fight is, and just a side note, I'm gonna be using lackluster a lot in this video because my vocabulary is fucking ass. I need to start reading more books I guess, but I will try to use some other words, so don't worry. But you know what else is lackluster? These guys' moveset. All they have is an annoying ass grab attack and the occasional attacks from the weird creepy ass enemies they summon, but did you know that you could actually get rid of them by having insights? Look, everyone and their mom knows that, bro. And doing that just makes the fight even more easier than what it already is. But that's a good thing because who in their right mind wants to spend 10 minutes of their time fighting the Witches of Hemwick? Absolutely no one, unless you're sick in the head, I don't know. Difficulty wise, the fight gets a 2 out of 10, and overall it's just a mid fight. Actually scratch that, it's way below mid, but it gets a pass for being super easy and not overstaying its welcome. Now we have the folding screen monkeys, an interesting idea for a boss. Basically they're based on the old Japanese proverb, hear no evil, speak no evil, see no evil, and do no evil, and each of the monkeys represent one of this. But with a boss with an interesting concept like this, there's no way they could mess this up, right? Wrong. The The fight goes on for way too long and it's actually just a cat and mouse game. I do give them credit though for trying to make the players sit down and study a boss that doesn't just require swinging a big sword until the health bar goes down. But what if that's what I'm trying to do? Bro, come on, like ain't nobody got time to read the patterns of chasing 3 boring ass monkeys around. But I just want to bash some heads in with no strategies involved. But I can at least say that the fight can be done pretty quickly on subsequent playthroughs with the right strategy. And at the end of the day, it's a pretty boring fight that overstays its welcome. Royal Rat Vanguard. It's just a bunch of rats, and the main rat has a mohawk, which is pretty funny, I'm not gonna lie. Armored Spider. One thing I realized with Demon Souls is that a lot of the bosses felt a bit gimmicky, this thing being one of them. There's not much to be said about the spider. Just go up, attack its thing. I don't really know what it is, but just attack it and run all the way back when it starts pissing all over the floor because the ground is gonna ignite in flames. Dodges web attacks while running towards him and rinse and repeat. So yeah, that's it. Just a regular ass boss fight. At least the design is kinda cool, I guess. It's just a spider, bro. It's nothing really crazy. Godskin Duo. Ooh, I couldn't wait to talk shit about these guys. What the hell was FromSoft thinking while making them? I guess they just looked at Ornstein and Smo and said, yeah, remember those 2 guys that the fans loved but we failed to make a true successor to them no matter how many times we tried? Yeah, let's add them here, but instead of making their moveset complement each other like Ornstein and Smo, we have them both coming at the player at full speed while throwing fireballs when, you know, said player tries to heal. Like, come on, this is not it, bro. They saw a skinny guy and a fat guy and just said, you know what, let's just throw them at the player. Again, their attacks don't complement each other at all. The big guy has this annoying ass rolling attack that sure you can stand on the pillars to avoid, but waiting for him to finish the attack takes so long. And not only that, but these guys have a lot of health which can make fighting them without summons so unbearable. And oh yeah, the difficulty for them gets a 9. I don't even know why I'm ranking the difficulty. Yeah, don't be surprised if I don't rank the difficulty for half of these bosses. But overall, the Godskin Duo are just not it. They're not fun to fight at all. Capra Demon. Capra Demon is one of the most hated fights in Dark Souls history due to 2 things. The small arena causing awkward camera angles and the 2 bitch ass dogs that can stun lock you, causing the Capra Demon to kill you easily. The Capra Demon on its own is actually somewhat easy as his attacks are very easy to dodge. But again, what makes this fight ranks this low is due to the dogs and the fact that it's just regular enemies jammed together. Made in Austria or Astria. The lore behind this fight is okay, I guess. And yes, I said I guess because I forgot what the hell Demon Souls is even about. But this fight is so embarrassingly bad. All you have to do is fight her boyfriend in this cramped spot and avoid most of his attacks. Because while this fight might be a joke, bro does hit like a truck. But it's easy to cheese him, and once you get past him and go down to her, all she does is talk to you and then boom, she died out of nowhere. But yeah, this fight is putting me to sleep, so moving on. Golden Hippo. I hate this boss fight so much. I can't find any redeeming thing about it. It's literally just a giant bitch ass hippo that can bend its head through its ass. I swear, no matter how I position myself, he always turns his big dumbass face around and hit me. I can literally be on the other side of his body and he would still find a way to hit me with his head. Plus his grab attack is also weird as shit. So yeah, overall, this boss can rot in hell for all I care. True King Alon, not to be confused with Old King Alon, which is the far more superior battle. This guy's just a slug that can talk. Honestly, I feel bad for even attacking him because, like, what the hell? He isn't even so easy it's funny like Miss Noble or Pinwheel because he's actually the final boss of the game. Like, the game just ended on that lame ass boss that can barely swing a sword to save his life. Before, I said that I felt bad for attacking him, but not gonna lie, killing him might be better because you're taking him out of his fucking misery, I guess. For a final boss battle, but this is just so underwhelming and disappointing. We're now heading into E tier. These are basically the bosses that aren't really fun or memorable, but at least they're not as bad as the ones in F tier. They're in between terrible and mid. First up, we have Rom the Vacuous Spider. When it comes on to bosses that focuses on making you fight multiple enemies at once, you can tell by some of the previous entries on the list that I genuinely despise them, unless they're done correctly. Rom unfortunately isn't done correctly. Now you might be thinking, who am I to say what FromSoft should consider correct? Well, anything apart from whatever the fuck Rom is. You see, while Rom has a cool looking arena and her design is pretty, you know, decent, the boss fight itself is just terrible due to the amount of high damaging enemy spider minions that surrounds her. These little shits has this annoying ass jump attack that can wipe out your entire health bar. Not only that, but Rom's moveset only consists of summoning a meteor shower, summoning meteors from the ground, an AoE blast, and her flopping around when she realizes that you're too close. Not only that, but the spiders that surround her makes it hard to hit her. And this sucks because attacking them isn't a viable option since their heads are made out of literal adamantium. So most players, including myself, would just avoid killing them and just head straight to Rom. Overall, Rom is just a terrible fight, but the reason why she finds herself in E tier and not F is because at least her arena looks cool. Grave robbers. Yeah, just throw more enemies into a boss room. That would be fun, right? Yeah, fuck that. This shit is so ass. First of all, it's hard to kill all of them when two of them keeps chasing you, barely giving you any time to breathe. You know what? I'm not even gonna talk about this fight. Like, it's just 3 fucking enemies thrown into a fucking room, bro. Like, not even regular enemies. They're just like NPCs, bro. This is not even a boss fight, bro. Yeah, that's why the whole Dark Souls 2 community dislikes them so much. I can't stand talking about them. Elden or whatever their name is. I'm probably butchering it, but whatever. Yet another unnecessary duo fight. The devs for Dark Souls 2 realized that Ava was a decent boss fight, so you know what they did? They added 2 of them in a room and called it a day. Look, this is the same reason why I will never stop shitting on Dark Souls 2, because it just does shit like this to piss the players off. First of all, let's not forget the horrible run back. If you thought Sir Alon's run back was bad, well, you've mistaken, because this shit is fucking horrible. Like, what were they thinking? And also, the bosses are just an exact copy of Ava, except the second one, which can now self-heal, which is annoying because it moves around a lot, which does not complement the slow pace of Dark Souls 2. Lud and Zalin are just not a fun fight, period. Man-eaters. I'm not gonna spend too much time talking about this lame-ass boss because there's not much that needs to be said. Their attack pattern is annoying because they'll attack you and then fly up in the air. They also feel super janky too, as some of their attacks can knock you off the ledge or bridge or whatever you're fighting them on. So yeah, bad boss fight, that's about it. Phalanx, another really mediocre fight. At least Phalanx gets a pass as the first actual boss of the game, but the design is ugly and it's literally just fighting a bunch of slugs with shields and yeah, trying not to get hit by the spears. It's just boring, that's it. Chained Ogre. Sekiro is a game that gets praised for its brilliant and addictive combat that focuses on deflections, and it deserves all the praise. But for some reason, FromSoft added a couple of bosses that doesn't follow the flow of combat that most other enemies in the game, do. The Chained Ogre is one of them. This boss sucks because most of the time it's just you running around him while he is doing an attack, then attacking him a few times and running around him again, rinse and repeat. It's just not fun, and yes, I know you can use the flame barrel to get some damage in, but that still doesn't make it any more of a fun fight. And let's not forget its awful grab attack hitbox. Half-Light Spear of the Church. Now we have a boss from Dark Souls 3, and Half-Light is my least favorite fight from that game, because he's basically a buffed up NPC that spams a lot. But what makes this fight worse is the painting guardians he summons that can heal him. Like, come on bro, was that even necessary? It's just a lame fight, that's it. But at least it did something cool where you can actually, fight an actual real life person that could control Half-Light. But that doesn't save it from being a terrible beyond mid, encounter. Miss Noble, everyone's second favorite meme boss. Now don't get me wrong, Miss Noble is my guy, that's literally my bro right there, but I have to be honest, he's just too easy. I mean, bro takes a beating worse than a kid that forgot to give his drunk dad another beer. But at the same time, I think this was good and intentional because FromSoft knew that a lot of the bosses in Sekiro are hard as hell. They probably just threw in Miss Noble as a quick confident boost for players. Still not a bad boss in my opinion, despite him being a joke. Patches. The human embodiment of diarrhea. Actually, I think that credit goes to Dung Eater. But Patches is just another meme boss. I mean, bro literally gives up halfway through the fight. Again, the fight reminds me of Miss Noble as it was a joke from the devs. And it's your typical NPC encounter. So it's not really like anything crazy special or whatever. Abductor Virgins. They get an edge over Patches because they look cooler. But other than that, fighting these two at a low level really sucks. So yeah, fuck them. At least their names are kind of funny, I guess. Crawling Magus and Congregation. Another multi-enemy boss fight, but this time they're super easy. It's just a bunch of random ass enemies that got thrown together in a boss room and being called a boss fight. It's just lame. Also, if I'm not spending too much time on these guys, it's because there isn't really much to be talked about. So yeah, moving on. Belfry Gargoyles. FromSoft remembered the Bell Gargoyles from Dark Souls 1 and said, hey, why not just do that again, but make it a bit more annoying? because you have to fight like 5 of them, and you can fight up to 3 at once. It's like Dark Souls 2 took 10 steps forward and 50 steps backward with a lot of the stuff they were trying to do. And this fight is just a prime example of that. Fire Giant. Before I say anything negative about this guy, let me start with the positives. First of all, I like his design. It's like the Beast Titan if he was a redhead. I also like the face on the stomach. That's about it with the compliments. Now the boss fight itself genuinely sucks. The first phase is basically you just bashing in his injured leg while he runs around the arena like a little ass kid, while also trying to bash you with his shield. But the worst part is the second phase, where it seems like his hands are his obvious weak points, but it's better off to just attack his legs instead. This guy took a lot of tries for me to beat on my first playthrough, and it was genuinely miserable, so I will forever hate the Fire Giant. Moonlight Butterfly. I know this is gonna sound a bit embarrassing, but on my recent playthrough of Dark Souls 1, I died to this guy like 3 times. Yes, I know, get your laughs in or whatever, but after I spun the block for the 4th time, I managed to defeat it. Moonlight is a very shitty boss fight due to the awkward projectile hitbox. Like the crystal dart that this thing always spams hit me no matter how good I think I dodge. Same thing with its beam attack and the overhead explosive projectile. And even putting that aside, this boss is just fucking lame as hell. Basically just you waiting for it to finish his attacks, hit it for a couple seconds, rinse and repeat. It's not really fun, just boring. The OST playing in the background is really nice though. Nox Duo. I was contemplating placing this side boss from Elden Ring onto this list, but I decided to do it anyways. And these 2 baddies are the first to show up. Now they're just 2 basic enemies thrown together in a boss room, so that automatically takes the fun out of it. But at least they're easy and don't overstay their welcome. Old Monk. The reason why this guy ranks higher than the previous bosses, especially Half-Light, at least he isn't annoying. And apparently, just like Half-Light, a random player can get summoned as the boss, which is pretty cool if you ask me. Blazing Bull. A boss that's similar to the Chained Ogre, to where he doesn't really follow the rules of the game. The best strategy is to just chase and attack until it staggers him. But yeah, it's just a boring boss fight that's, you know, not really fun. Sakura Bull. Just a bigger reskin of the Blazing Bull. The reason why I rank it higher is because it's prettier looking than it, but that's about it. Still the same lame ass boss. The Crystallians. I'm gonna rank all the Crystallian bosses together. They are the definition of okay. But one thing I like that gave me a scare on my first playthrough is the fact that they don't take a lot of damage until their skin breaks, and they go from scary and intimidating to pushovers. Their moveset is also something I'm 50-50 on. On one hand, I really like the robotic animations they have, but at the same time, they don't have a lot in their moveset. But these are just cave bosses, so I'm gonna give them a pass on roasting them. Deacons of the Deep. I don't want to start every sentence by saying, oh, these guys are bad, blah blah blah, but you have to understand, these bosses in the lower tiers are genuinely not that good. Basically, it's just attacking the glowing red deacons and then waiting for the main deacon to appear. The fight is easy, but you can definitely die a couple times due to their ability to cover the whole room in cursed energy like it's Jujutsu Kaisen or some shit. And that curse can literally insta-kill you if the bar fills up. But apart from that, they're not a super terrible boss, just really lame and boring. Ancient Wyvern, everyone's favorite dragon fight. Yeah, I'm just playing, no one likes this guy. And I think the reason why Ancient Wyvern gets a lot of hate is because he's not even funny bad like Miss Noble, because he's just a one-hit kill. But at the same time, the reason why I placed him higher than Miss Noble is because if you want, you can make him an actual challenge. Because basically the right way of killing this thing is to traverse a small level of annoying enemies and reach above his head on a platform, then plunge attack. But if you're a madman, you can actually fight him without doing all of that. But trust me, it's not worth it. I mean, he barely takes any damage at all. Overall, he's just another below mediocre gimmick fight that gets a lot of shit from the community. Dragon God. Before playing Demon Souls, I already knew Dragon God was considered a disappointment by a lot of people in the community, so when the game came out on PS5, I decided to try it, and I finally made my way to fight him, and yeah, I can see where the disappointment came from. He's basically a poorly done stealth boss. You have to hide behind the pillars so that he doesn't see you, and for a guy with 5 fucking eyes, you'd think that this would be hard, but no, he's basically blind. But hiding isn't the only thing you should be doing, because you have to make your way to 2 ballistas and shoot it dealing massive damage. And after hitting it with both ballistas, he will be immobilized, and now you have to finishing off by hitting his chin. So now you can see why people thought this fight was a letdown, cause he was basically hyped up in the trailers and promo materials. He was literally the poster boy of the game, but unfortunately he was way too easy. By the way, side note, why the hell does it have two freaking ballistas pointing at him in his own boss room? Like what? Another weird thing is, isn't his name Dragon God? And you know dragons can fly, and it clearly has wings, so why not just fly? Whatever man, I'm not gonna think too deeply about it, but before I move on, I just want to say something. I don't believe a boss should be hard for it to be good. You can have an easy boss that's still really fun if it's done properly, and honestly, most times I prefer an easy fight done well compared to a super hard fight that's just hard for the sake of being hard. I just wanted to get that out of the way because I know it may sound like I'm just hating on any boss that's too easy or whatever, but trust me, that's not the case. Ceaseless Discharge. What the hell type of name is that? Ceaseless Discharge, like come on, y'all couldn't think of anything else? I'm gonna let it slide though because it's kind of funny. Anyway, Ceaseless is just your typical big boss towering over you while you're on a narrow platform or ledge. If you're confused on what I mean by that, do you remember those bosses that you'd fight in mostly like 2D platformers where there's some giant guy and you're fighting them on a small narrow platform like in Blasphemous or something? That aside, Ceaseless is a boss that I don't like encountering, mostly because he's just lame. Yeah, sure, his design, while messed up looking, still looks cool in a weird way, but that's about it. Plus, I find it funny how you can just cheese him at the entrance and insta-kill him. Anyways, moving on. Centipede Demon. So reviewing this boss was a bit weird since it seems like I was a tad bit over leveled for the fight, so it ended in a short time. I even had my boy Solaire there hoping that this boss would, you know, put up more of a challenge, but no, he went down in a short time. But I'm gonna go off distant memory for this. The most I can say is that it's not really a hard boss fight. Just don't fight it at the entrance and you're pretty much good. The lava damage does suck though, which can definitely make the fight a bit harder since you're using around 1 or 2 of your flasks. But yeah, kind of an underwhelming boss fight, and the design is kind of just, I don't even like the design that much, but that's whatever. But yeah, that's kind of to be expected since it's not even the main boss in this region. And to be fair, the main boss of this region fucking sucks. We already talked about it. Pinwheel. Pinwheel is a very easy boss to the point where he basically became a meme in the series. Pinwheel's difficulty always felt weird to me. He felt like a super early game boss that was placed in a high level area. Maybe it was an inside joke with the devs, which is most likely the case as Miss Noble felt like one too. Thing is, the enemies around him felt way more intimidating and difficult, and so is the level design before and after facing him. In terms of movesets and attacks, I literally don't remember what his attacks are because by the time my brain started thinking again, he was already dead. So yeah, that's Pinwheel. Adon, Thief of Fire. With a name that cool, you'd think bro would spam anything other than this lame ass floating fireball, but no, he just spams that over and over and over again. Plus he's super easy. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about him because he feels like an NPC that they decided, you know, to make a boss fight. Fool's Idol. The boss fight is basically just hitting her till she disappears, summons her clones, and trying to find the right one, which is easy because there's only 3 clones. But the thing that's annoying about the fight is the symbol that appears on the ground that immobilizes you for like a couple seconds. But other than that, she's a weak boss and she's not really fun. Jory the Elder Inquisitor. Jory sucks ass, that's all I'm gonna say. Okay, I will explain. He's basically a regular mob type enemy that was given a health bar, and what makes him really annoying to deal with is the constant spamming of holy attacks and the fact that he can summon a bunch of annoying enemies. He's just not a good boss, period. Lone Shadow. To be honest, most of the Lone Shadow boss fights aren't bad, but the reason why they rank this low is because they always choose to battle you in the most cramped areas possible. I'm specifically talking about the one in the tunnel. I swear the camera was fighting me harder than this guy was. It's just, why would you play such an agile boss in such a cramped area where the camera is gonna mess up? I don't know, FromSoft definitely wants to see us suffer at times. But yeah, overall, these guys aren't bad. I'm specifically talking about the one in the tunnel. Snake Eyes. At first I felt awkward fighting these gunmen or women because their moveset used to confuse me, and they had that one annoying grab attack that they would do quite often. However, after learning their patterns, I realized that they aren't too bad. Plus, unlike the lone shadows, they choose to fight you in more open areas. Now we're gonna move on to D tier. These are the bosses that aren't bad, but just aren't super memorable. They have some enjoyable moments, but you're not gonna see any of them in anyone's top 10. First up at the bottom of D tier, we have the Valiant Gorgoyles. Here we go with yet another unfun duo fight. I usually recommend fighting these guys at a somewhat higher level just to defeat them quickly. On their own, they're not that bad, but together they're really annoying, especially with the poison mist that can stun lock you for some reason. At least you have to only fight one of them until, it reaches half health. Not a super bad fight, but just super unremarkable. Black Blade Kindred. This spot isn't only for Kindred, but for all the other solo Gargoyle bosses. Now, to be honest, unlike most people, I don't really hate fighting these guys. Don't get me wrong though, I'm not usually super excited to fight them, but if I have the time and I want some extra runes, I don't mind fighting them. Now, Kindred can be annoying at times, especially with his, destined death attacks, but its moveset is pretty easily telegraphed, making it easy to tell when to attack from when not to attack, and that goes for all the Gargoyles as well. Now, the two main reasons why I think not a lot of people like these guys are the fact that there are reskins, meaning you have to fight them multiple times in the game, and also the fact that they can do a lot of damage, and sometimes they dodge a lot too, which sucks if you have a larger weapon. But overall, I don't think they're too bad. Trolls. Okay, so the reason why the Trolls gets a higher spot than the Gargoyles is because sure, there are reskins, but at least they aren't super hard, which means they don't overstay their welcome. Also, they just look funny. Thea's Champions. This boss fight in Elden Ring is a unique encounter that pits you against a series of NPC invaders, offering a refreshing change from traditional boss battles. Its dynamic, challenging, and lore-rich context makes it engaging and a memorable fight within the game's expansive world. Yeah, that's cap. I was literally so bored trying to find something interesting to say about these guys, I had to give up and ask ChatGPT for help. Not a super bad boss, but they're just so boring and unremarkable. Headless. Definitely my least favorite mini boss in Sekiro. I usually go out my way not to fight these guys because they're a bit annoying. Now, I do give them credit because they require perfect deflecting, but it's the other aspects of the fight that's bad. First of all, they deal terror damage, which can insta-kill you if the meter fills up. Second of all, their arenas slow you down over time, and third of all, you have to go out your way to get divine confetti in order to deal damage to them. And having to find a limited and scarce resource in order to fight a mid-boss is just weird in my opinion. Gaping Dragon. The Gaping Dragon is a fight that's not all that exciting, but it does its job well in my opinion. I think it's just an okay boss fight. What I found interesting is that his moveset, at least his crawling animation, reminds me of the Magma Worm from Elden Ring. Now, in terms of difficulty, this fight was surprisingly easy. I mean, this thing looks scary as hell, so I thought it would be, very challenging. Especially considering that I walked into the boss fight with only 3 flasks instead of the usual 5 or 10. Overall though, the Gaping Dragon is a mediocre encounter, but that doesn't mean it's bad or anything, cause honestly, while this fight lacks in challenge, it definitely does a great job at showing FromSoft's cool art style. Commander Gaius. To be honest, I'm very disappointed in Gaius. I can tell he's a good boss, but just covered under a pile of shit. And that pile of shit happens to be 1. His shitty charge attack that's almost impossible to dodge, 2. His non-ending combos and the fact that he barely gives you any room to punish, and 3. The fact that he can't stay still at all. All of those things really makes this boss fight a letdown in my opinion. Falling Star Beast, not the full grown ones, just the regular small ones. Not gonna lie, the design of these guys are really cool. Like, you're literally fighting an overgrown alien bull. Plus, for a bull, its moveset is pretty interesting and vast, especially its anti-gravity slam. While these guys aren't my go-to bosses when starting a new run, I can't deny that they are somewhat cool and fun to fight. Sometimes. Sin, the Slumbering Dragon. I know a lot of people praise Sin for being the best dragon fight in Dark Souls 2, but in my opinion, fighting him feels a bit lackluster. The fight itself kind of feels a bit janky as well. I don't know how to explain it, but I guess Sin kind of seems a bit stiff in his animation. But as a dragon fight, I think it's not bad because he does fly around and shoot fire, which is typical dragon shit. But definitely nowhere close to being the best dragon fight in the entire series. Crucible Knight Duo. I was gonna rank all the Crucible Knights under one spot, but these guys are literally shit stains and I hate them. Now, the only reason why they aren't lower is because 1, you can use summons to distract one of them, making the fight somewhat more tolerable, and 2, They're optional, which means you can come back at a stronger level and defeat them. But that said, they're still kinda ass. I mean, what's with Souls games and throwing two super fast paced enemies in one room and calling it a boss fight? On their own, they're pretty okay, but again, fighting them together is just overkill. Also, good luck trying to heal because these guys will attack you as soon as you try to drink your flask. Royal Rat Authority. This thing is literally Sif's meth-headed cousin who never amounted to anything in its life. Unlike Sif, who is cute, cuddly, and noble, this guy is literally just a disease-ridden, overgrown dog rat. It looks like a regular-sized dog enemy that the devs just sized up a bit and give it a bit more moves in his arsenal. But that aside, the reason why this fight ranks in D tier is because of the annoying ass rats and the toxin. And if you don't remember what toxin is, it's literally poison on crack. Overall, just a super mid boss. Lawrence the First Vicar. Lawrence, where do I even start with you? Throughout the main game of Bloodborne, we've heard Lawrence's name a couple times. So when I finally stumbled on this guy and woke him up just to find out he was Lawrence, I was kind of excited for an amazing boss fight. But unfortunately, what I got was a beefed up reskin of Cleric Beast, except that his second phase is way more annoying, because for some reason his legs literally explodes and lava starts flowing out of his ass. Which makes the fight harder than it's supposed to be because you now have to stick to his side, and even doing that, you're still gonna get hit. And he hits hard, trust me. Overall, he's just not really a good boss fight in my opinion. He's not super bad, but just not super good either. Wormface. Let's be honest, no one was expecting an S tier boss fight from a guy called Wormface. I mean, there's just not much to be said here. He's pretty easy except that his Deathblind miss can be really annoying to deal with, and overall, it's just a basic fight. I mean, yeah, that's about it. Cause let's be honest, no one cares about Wormface. Ancient Dragon. Ancient Dragon gets a lot of mixed reception from the community. On one hand, a lot of people really appreciate the lore surrounding him and the challenge he brings. However, on the other hand, a lot of people hate his boring attacks, especially that fire breathing one where he flies up in the air and he has an enormous health pool, which means that the fight lasts way too long. While I do appreciate a hard fight, I do think that the fire breath is kind of bullshit. That's about it for me. Not the best dragon fight in the series by any means, but as a standard boss, I think he does his job pretty well. Old Iron King. Remember when I was talking about how a lot of the bosses in 2D games are literally just big enemies towering over you while you're on a small platform? That's literally Old Iron King. His moveset isn't too spectacular or interesting, but one thing I can definitely say is that I love his presentation. His design is a bit generic if you ask me, but he's still cool at the end of the day. And his arena, while weird, is still interesting. Magma Worm. All the Magma Worms fight are just bland if you ask me. Don't get me wrong, they're cool to fight on a first encounter, but let's be honest, they're not really all that exciting, especially their moveset. Speaking of moveset, I hate their crawling attack because for some reason just even touching them can send you flying 20 feet backwards. Deathbirds. Design wise, they get a 10. I really like their oddly shaped head for some reason. But other than that, they're not really super fun to fight, at least to me. They do have some cool attacks though, but I don't know, there's just something that I don't like about them. Also, speaking of design, I feel like they're like a cursed version of Tweety Bird or whatever, I don't know, I just realized that. Duke's Dear Freya. I'm not gonna lie, this boss is actually kinda cool. First of all, its design is awesome. It's literally a two-headed spider, and sure, its moveset isn't too outstanding as it just spams lasers all the time. And the spiders can make the fight a bit more annoying than it should be, but at the end of the day, it's a really dope looking boss. Dark Sun Gwendolyn, everyone's favorite femboy. Gwendolyn isn't really an exciting fight because most of it is just you chasing and dodging his various sorcery attacks and then hitting him 1 or 2 times and then repeating the process over again until he dies. So yeah, not really exciting. However, the lore behind him and the fight itself is interesting because you're literally fighting the son of Gwyn, the Lord of Cinder, and in order to fight him, you have to attack the illusion of Guinevere, which angers Gwendolyn. I don't really have anything else to say about him. He's just an okay fight. Leonin the Misbegotten. I like to call this guy Baby Gale because their movesets are a bit similar. However, unlike Gale, this guy is just a reskin, and that kind of takes away his aura and excitement. But at the same time, surprisingly, he's actually a fun boss at the end of the day. Mimic Tier. The concept of this boss is cool. It's literally just you versus yourself, which you would think would make a surprisingly hard boss, but no, Mimic Tier is super easy. But again, it's a cool concept to test out whether or not your build is good. The Last Giant. The Last Giant isn't really a super exciting or memorable boss fight, but I think that's the point. Because if I remember correctly, the guy is literally the Giant Lord from the past but was kept prisoner by Vendrick. Now he's just a zombie-like creature. This boss isn't really to show how strong and powerful he is, but basically to show his fall from grace. In terms of gameplay, his attacks are pretty lame. All he does is stomp around, and then in his second phase he rips off his arms and use it as a weapon, which is pretty cool and terrifying at the same time. But yeah, that's basically his boss fight in a nutshell. Cursed Rotted Greatwood. I find the visual aspects of this fight interesting, as it looks like a cursed mutated tree that gains sentience, but from what I remember in the lore, apparently the Greatwood was actually a spirit tree. However, the inhabitants of the undead settlement sealed away their curse into the tree, and after a while the tree was overflowing with these said curses, and now it became rotted and malformed. Now gameplay wise, this boss gets a lot of shit from the community, which I'm a bit 50-50 on. Sure, the Rotted Greatwood might not be a super cool fight mechanic wise, except for when it smashes the ground and you begin to fall, cause that shit looks cool as hell. But it's still a cool encounter, at least for a first time playthrough. Gideon the All-Knowing. Or what I like to call him, Gideon the All Yapping, cause all bro does is talk and talk and talk. Even in his death, he's still yapping about something. Now, as an NPC fight, Gideon is actually one of the better ones, and this is because he has a really cool thing where the more bosses you defeat, the more spell he has in his arsenal, which is kind of creepy because it seems like he was spying on you on your journey. His boss fight can be a bit annoying at times though, as he literally just spams magic and incantations while barely giving you a second to breathe. But if you backstab him in the beginning and have a high damaging weapon, you can literally kill him under 1 minute. Long Arm Centipede. This thing ranks a bit higher than the rest because it's a boss that requires deflection. You know, that thing that is the main mechanic of Sekiro. So yeah, deflecting this guy is pretty fun, and if you're good enough, you can kill him under a minute. Crystal Sage. On my first ever Dark Souls 3 playthrough, this guy gave me such a hard time, especially in his second phase, where he summons a bunch of high damaging clones. But on subsequent playthroughs, he was really easy. It's not like there was some formula I had to figure out in order to beat him. No, it was just that I really sucked on my first playthrough. And come on, it was literally my first ever Souls game too, so count me some slack. Basically, all you have to do is just attack him until phase 2, hurry up and kill his clones while dodging his crystal sorceries, and then attack him, rinse and repeat, just like any other boss fight. Ashina Elite. This guy is just a stronger, more buffed up enemy variant of the other Ashina soldiers roaming around. This fight shouldn't be too long if you're good at deflecting, because all he does is the same move over and over until his posture bar becomes full. Not really a super cool fight, but it's kind of a fun one, to be honest. Tree Spirits. The Tree Spirits are some of my least favorite encounters in Elden Ring, mostly because of how weird their attack patterns are. Their attacks are so hard to read at times. Remember when I said that sometimes a boss with a simple, boring moveset can hold it back from, you know, ranking high? Now that I think about it, I don't really remember saying that, but basically these guys are the opposite. They do way too much while also giving you a small amount of time to attack them. And unfortunately, that's kind of the trend of Elden Ring, where a boss does super long chains of combos and, you know, attacks and only giving you like a split second to attack them. Skeleton Lords. The Skeleton Lords are a bunch of skeleton that happens to be lords. Yeah, it's just a fucking skeleton fight. Whoa, that's fucking fun, I guess. Especially dealing with these same skeleton guys from Dark Souls 1. Like, man, this is just a really fun boss fight, isn't it? Executioner Chariot. At least compared to the Skeleton Lords, this boss fight is a bit more exciting. First off, it starts with you having to position yourself in the corners so you don't get hit by the chariot. Then making your way around and then pulling the lever, which drops the cell, which then causes the chariot to crash. Now the real fight begins. The horse's attacks are kind of weird to dodge, especially its charged headbutt, but overall if you cleared out the necromancer guys and killed all the skeletons, then this fight shouldn't be too hard. Now, is it a super fun fight? Not really, but I can at least appreciate what they were trying to do. Myth of the Baneful Queen. Before I even start with the boss fight, what I find weird is how the devs thought that placing this windmill right here would make players think that, oh, I should burn it. Bro, it doesn't even look flammable. Now the reason why I mention this is because setting the windmill on fire actually removes the poison from Mytha's boss room, making her fight a bit more bearable. In terms of moveset and attacks, just like many other Dark Souls 2 bosses, they were a bit boring and bland. Except for the one where she just yeets her head at you and causes a mini explosion. That's kind of cool, I guess. But overall, her difficulty is around a 9 with poison and a 5 without it. And in terms of quality, she's just mid. Tibia Mariner. Not gonna lie, despite these guys being such pushovers, their aestheticness is pretty cool. Their movesets are also kinda like interesting as well. Sure, there isn't too much going on here other than the occasional boat splash and the giant skeleton beam, but they're still cool at the end of the day. All that aside, there isn't too much to be said here. I just think that the Tibia Mariner does its job pretty well as a field boss in Elden Ring. Covetous Demon, one of the blandest, most boring looking bosses in Dark Souls 2, yet for some reason I really like fighting him. I don't know, maybe it's because he looks funny or the fact that he's so easy to the point where it's almost a meme, but he's just fun to me. I don't even know why. But it's only fair to rank him here since, personal bias aside, he's still a rather boring boss. Scorpioness Najka, Dolitry Quelaag, except this time she's a scorpion. She doesn't give off the same visual aura as Quelaag, and the fight itself is boring, so is the arena. Demi-Human Queens, another easy Elden Ring field boss, but for some odd reason I actually like fighting them. Maybe because they remind me of some beast-like bosses you would see in Bloodborne, but overall, I think they're a pretty cool encounter. Twin Dragon Riders, another duo fight placed in a tight room that serves zero purpose other than to just give the players an unnecessary bad time. The only good thing about these guys is that they don't have a lot of health, so dealing with them isn't too bad. So I guess they even failed at trying to challenge the players, by giving them an actually challenging fight. But the fact that there are a copy-pasted boss fight from earlier in the game doesn't help them at all either. Overall, they're not a bad fight, but just super lame. Like, they have zero aura. High Lord Wolnir. Now, speaking of aura, we have the High Lord himself. Wolnir is technically a gimmick fight as you have to attack his bracelets in order to deal damage to him. This makes him super easy, but the only attack that can really give you a hard time is if you get too close to his belly and all the gas he's been smoking will give you lung cancer or some shit, causing you to instantly die. But boss fight aside, what I really like about Wolnir is his presence. He's one of the main reasons why I think that playing Dark Souls on your first playthrough is like playing a horror game. But despite his size and intimidating stature, bro is surprisingly easy, and he's not really fun to fight either. Living Failures. These guys really live up to their names. They have some boring ass attacks because most of the time they will just swing their big stupid arms around and are occasionally headbutting the player, or sometimes spam their magic attack. But the move they constantly use the most is the meteor shower, and at first you would think it's super hard to dodge, but no. All you have to do is go behind the tree and you're pretty much good. One thing I can definitely give them credit on is the fact that they do a lot of damage, but other than that, this fight is just so lame. But at least after defeating them, you get to fight one of the best bosses in the game. Throne Watcher and Throne Defender, yet another duo fight. Now, I've been shitting on a lot of these bosses, so I'm gonna just say something nice about these two. Moving on. Twin Sentinels, a rather basic fight. It's just 3 dudes swinging their pole arms around and shit. Their health pool is really small, but the difficult part is fighting the last 2 Sentinels as it's kinda hard to space them out, but that's about it. I just realized that their attack patterns are a bit similar to the Crystallians from Elden Ring. That's kinda cool, I guess. Shadows of Yharnam. Holy shit, another gang squad fight. As much as I don't like Shadows of Yharnam, I can at least say that they aren't a boring boss fight, because they will keep you on the edge of your seat. The reason why I say this is because it's a gang fight and you have to keep focus on all 3 of them. After taking down one of them, the other 2 grow snakes out of their head, and now they can summon a giant snake out of the ground. Is it an annoying attack? Yes. But is it cool looking? Also yes. Now, despite this, the Shadows of Yharnam is still one of my least favorite boss in Bloodborne. Bell Gargoyles. The original Gargoyle fight and the best one compared to the rest, but despite that, fighting them both at the same time with the slowness of Dark Souls 1 can really get annoying. However, the fight is way more enjoyable when you get rid of the first one as quick as possible. And to be fair, the game gives you enough time to take down the first one's health, so that managing the second one could be easier. Again, as much as I hate duo fights, I like both of them, because both enemies aren't constantly on your ass, so that's why these guys rank a bit higher than the rest, because they give you breathing room. Taurus Demon, a very average boss fight without anything too spectacular going on. The arena is a bit cramped, which makes it kinda annoying. However, just staying under his groin is the best option to deal with him. Also, the fact that you can get an easy plunge attack on him in the beginning makes this fight a pushover, but despite that, he does his job well as the second boss of the game, showing you what's to come later on. Celestial Emissary. These alien mofos reminded me of the living failures, mostly because they're all aliens. While the emissaries are a bit easier, they definitely look cooler. This fight starts off with fighting off a bunch of baby aliens until the big one spawns in. Now the big guy hits hard, but sometimes bigger doesn't mean better, because in this case he just becomes an easier target. And in no time this boss fight is done. Difficulty wise, this fight gets a 3 out of 10, but in terms of atmosphere and visuals it gets an 8. Leechmonger. A symbiotic monster ran by a legion of leeches. You gotta be high coming up with some shit like this. The fight itself is pretty okay, but don't expect anything too crazy other than it's self-healing, but as a melee non-gimmick fight, it's not too bad. Dirty Colossus, another pure melee non-gimmicky fight from Demon Souls. It isn't too challenging, as the only hard part is getting through the horrible level prior, but at the end of the day it's an okay fight. Elena, or Elana, the Scalet Queen. She gave me a harder time than I thought, but to be fair, I was fighting her with a bonfire aesthetic that bumped that specific area to New Game Plus, and also my summon died towards the ending of the fight, making her, you know, a bit more harder for me. Now her boss fight itself is rather mid, and in my opinion not super fun, as her gimmick is that she can summon a bunch of enemies to help her. The easiest enemies to deal with are the golden skeletons, but then she summoned Velstad out of nowhere and it brought up the difficulty of the fight. Her attacks, while deadly, aren't super hard to dodge, as she mostly relies on her summons and teleportations to catch you off guard. Overall, I don't really like bosses that relies on summoning enemies in order to make the fight more challenging. All in all, she's not super fun, but she isn't too bad either, and I can only assume fighting her on a regular game cycle makes this fight much more tolerable. Adjudicator. A gimmick fight that I find cool for some reason. All you gotta do is hit its stomach where it's injured, dodge his high damaging sword swings, and wait for him to fall so you can hit the golden bird on its head. That's basically the whole fight, but then again, I'm not gonna shit on it because I really like the design of this boss. The Rotten. The design of the Rotten is pretty cool, as it's a bunch of bodies fused into each other, creating whatever the hell this is. But in terms of gameplay, he feels like a mixture of the Adjudicator, minus the golden bird of course, and the Dirty Colossus from Demon Souls. Overall, it's a pretty average fight, nothing too special going on. I do hate the fire in the arena though. Aldia. I know Aldia gets a lot of shit from the community, but for some reason I actually like his boss fight. I don't know, there's just something fun about timing your attacks properly, and while he's not one of my favorite bosses, I can't deny he's kind of fun at times. Crucible Knight and Misbegotten Warrior. I find this fight more fun if you bring a spirit summon with you, but there's not much more that needs to be said here, because these guys are literally separate bosses that were placed together in one room. But the only reason why they rank a bit higher is because the moveset on each of them is pretty cool, especially the Crucible Knight. Tower Knight, a somewhat fun gimmick fight, but mechanically it's pretty straightforward. Just take out its legs until it falls so you can hit his head, rinse and repeat. Now the visual aspect of this boss is really cool, as he's just a big ass giant knight. I don't know, I just find that cool for some reason, but other than that, it's a pretty simple fight. Asylum Demon. This is how you do a basic boss fight. The Asylum Demon might not be the coolest looking boss, nor does it have a cool moveset, but it being simple is good enough because he's basically a great way of showing the player the basics of the game. Omen Killers. Before I get into the boss fight itself, I find the lore behind these guys really interesting. Apparently, as their name indicates, these guys go around and they kill omens. They even wear the masks that mimics the visages the omens see in their nightmares, basically just mocking them. But lore aside, the boss fight is rather simple but decent. Their attacks do a lot of damage, especially their jumping ones, but other than that, there isn't anything to worry about. The fight itself isn't anything to write home about either, but I think they're decent enough to get placed in high D tier. Flexile Sentry. Okay, you know what? These D tier bosses have been really boring to talk about, and as much as I want this video to be a bit long, I'm not gonna force myself to yap about these boring ass boss fights like holy shit. So yeah, I'm gonna just speed run the rest of D tier. Flexile Sentry, they're okay I guess. Their design is pretty cool too. It's just two guys fused in one. That's kind of dope, I'm not gonna lie. Old Hero, an interesting boss fight. The level leading to him is actually harder than the boss itself. I also like how you have to use stealth in order to gain the upper hand on him. His design is pretty sick as well. Red Wolf of Radagon. Mom, can we have Sif? No son, we have Sif at home, head ass. All jokes aside, the design of the Red Wolf is kinda alright, and his magic attacks, while annoying, looks pretty. Storm King. In terms of visuals, probably the best looking boss in Demon Souls. Gameplay wise, I'm kinda 50-50 on. On one hand, I really like the animation of the Storm Ruler, which gives this fight a cinematic feeling, but on the other, I really wish it was more than just, you know, that one charged attack. Giant Lord, basically the same fight as the last giant. However, this time he has way more aura, and instead of using his arm as a weapon, he uses a sword instead. I'm gonna give this boss a 6 out of 10 in overall rating. I do like the fact that you fight him in the middle of a war though, that's pretty cool. Astal Stars of Darkness. I don't like this version of Astal because the arena is less beautiful and he has way more health and does more damage, and yeah, he's just a reskin. Orin of the Water. I know it's a bit controversial to put her this low on this list, but I'm not really a super fan of her. I don't know why. Maybe it's because of her weird movements and attack patterns, but yeah. She just didn't grow on me like how she did for some people. Her moveset is pretty cool despite it being weird, and her design is also simple but oddly beautiful. But again, I just didn't enjoy fighting her. The Drunkard and the Glutton. These guys are actually somewhat fun to fight, but the only thing holding them back is the entourage of enemies they have guarding them. But yeah, apart from that, they are some of the coolest mini bosses in Sekiro. Godskin Noble. I used to hate fighting this fat ass guy, but now I know how to deal with him. Kinda. I still think his rolling attack and the rapid thrust attacks are bullshit. Vanguard Demon, a similar boss to the Asylum Demon. A pretty basic fight, nothing too crazy. Onyx Lord, his gravity magic attacks looks fire and his sword looks cool too. His moveset is also somewhat deep, which is surprising for a mini boss. So yeah, at least he was a fun fight. Fell Twins. I like how the boss room is just pitch black while these two monstrosities come out and start running towards you. It makes it feel like a horror game. Their movesets are similar to any other Omen creatures in Elden Ring because they are literally just regular enemies thrown into a boss room. But apart from that, I still like them. Okami Leader. Remember the footballers in Sekiro? This guy is basically one of them. Believe it or not, I actually like fighting him, especially when it comes on to lightning reversal because it's a pretty fun mechanic. But I wish he had at least 2 health bars to make the fight a bit more challenging. Godskin Apostle. On his own, the Apostle is actually not a bad fight. His moveset is dope and the Black Flame incantations make it even better. The only thing I hate is when you try to heal and he would just immediately throw a fireball at you. But apart from that, he's way better than the Godskin Noble. Guardian Dragon. To be honest, the only reason why this guy is this high in D tier is because I have a soft spot for dragons, believe it or not, and the arena looks nice. I mean, it looks like a giant bird cage. Cleric Beast. The Cleric Beast does an amazing job as a first boss because it shows the players what to expect from most beast-like bosses that's to come later on in the game. His attacks aren't anything special, but the aggressive nature of it makes it clear that the game rewards an aggressive playstyle, and I really like that. Plus, remember when I said that most bosses in D tier aren't memorable? Yeah, I take it back, because everyone remembers the screaming entrance of Cleric Beast. Headless Ape. This is another fight that probably shouldn't rank this high, but then again, it's D tier, so who cares? This boss isn't really fun, mostly because 1, it's a duo fight, which is weird, because Sekiro's combat system is mostly focused on one-on-one encounters, and another reason why this fight kinda sucks is because it's basically the first and second phase of the Guardian Ape fight put together, but this time you have to battle them at the same time. At least the female ape is somewhat easy to take down, but overall this fight shouldn't exist. To be honest, I think I should have ranked it a bit lower, but I'ma just let it slide. Full grown Falling Star Beast. Pretty much the same fight as the regular Falling Star Beast, except it's a bit bigger and has a bit more attacks. I think the fight is pretty cool, but everything I said about the baby Falling Star pretty much applies here, except that he's bigger, which I like. Pause. Black Knife Assassins. They're all pretty decent fights and they also have a lot in their arsenal. The only thing holding them back is that they could have been a bit more flashy with some of their attacks, but that's just me though. And finally, at the top spot of D tier, we have Udex Gundyr. You know what's crazy? I used to call this guy Ludex until I made this video. For some reason, I always thought it was an L, but no, it's an I. Okay, that aside, out of all the first bosses I've mentioned so far, Gundyr is probably the best one tutorial wise. The reason being is because moving from Dark Souls 2 to 3, you have to get used to the faster paced combat, and Gundyr teaches you that very quickly. So no more strafing around and attacking, because this mofo will literally swing his halberd behind his back to attack you. He also teaches the players that never played Bloodborne that you have to watch out for the second phases, because most bosses in this game have that. At the end of the day, he's a good fight and an amazing first boss. And we're at the end of D tier. Finally. For some reason, D tier had the most bosses in it, but thankfully we're finished. But before we move on, I wanted to say that D tier had at least some enjoyable fights in it. However, while some were enjoyable, they're definitely not bosses that I'm excited to fight. So let's move on to C tier. And at the bottom of C tier we have the Old Dragon Slayer. The Old Dragon Slayer seems to get a decent amount of love from the community, mostly because he's a copy-pasted reskin version of a beloved boss fight from the previous game. But despite him being a doppelganger, I actually like this boss fight a lot. Ever since Dark Souls 1, I always wondered how it would be just fighting Ornstein alone, and this guy is the answer to that. Except he doesn't have any second phase, just like most of the other bosses in the game. Now the one thing I do hate about this encounter and many other encounters in Dark Souls 2 is that trying to heal will get you killed more than anything else. And unfortunately, Ornstein's fanboy doesn't give you any time to heal because of input reading. All in all, he's a great C tier boss fight. Dark Lurker. First of all, the run back to this boss is absolute trash, and I don't know what FromSoft was smoking thinking that this was a good idea. Now the boss fight itself is pretty mid if you ask me. Don't get me wrong, the design of Dark Lurker looks cool as hell, as he looks like an angel born from the abyss, or at least corrupted by it, but his boss fight is kinda mediocre if you ask me. He has some cool but awkward projectile attacks, as the hitbox on them can be a bit bullshit. And he also summons a copy of himself into the fight. Man, I just love when boss fights have multiple enemies you have to focus on. But to be fair, he's not that bad. I just think the run back drains all the energy I have before the fight, which makes fighting the actual boss itself not a fun experience. But despite the negatives, I'm still gonna place him here at C tier because at least he was a bit enjoyable. Alva the King's Pet. Alva is actually quite a fun fight that only gets held back due to Dark Souls 2 jank, and by that I mean the unnecessarily slow healing time and some terrible hitbox. But apart from that, she's decent and one of the better bosses in the entire game. The arena looks cool as well, as it's not the typical bland or boring arenas that's in the rest of the game. Overall, I really like this fight, and if she just had a few more additional attacks, I would have placed her higher. Amygdala. I was originally gonna rank the Amygdala at high D tier, but I thought this was a bit unfair since it's a very memorable boss, especially when it comes onto its design. I mean, the thing looks like a giant alien man spider. Visuals aside, the boss fight itself is your typical beast-like encounter, except its head is its biggest weakness. In its first phase, it will do the occasional ground stomp, and it will also shoot a laser beam at you. However, in its second phase, it gets enraged, and just like the last giant, it rips off its arm and uses it as a weapon. But instead of one arm, this mofo pulls off two of them and starts swinging them aimlessly, and he also does a jump slam attack. Ultimately, while the Amygdala isn't my favorite boss in Bloodborne, it still holds a place in my heart due to the visual aspects alone. Godfroy. This boss should not exist. Period. It's literally a reskin of the much better Godric the Grafted. The only reason why I put him in C tier is because of the fact that his moveset is identical to first phase Godric, which automatically means he's gonna rank a bit higher than most other bosses I've mentioned. Dragon Rider. I really like this fight, and I think it's one of the more underrated bosses in the entire game. I just have a soft spot for non-gimmicky blade-wielding bosses. I also like how small the arena is, giving you a bit more challenge. Lost Sinner, one of the better melee-focused bosses in this game. Her moveset, while basic, gets the job done, but the only thing I dislike is the room not being big enough for healing, but that's it, she's pretty awesome. Royal Knight Loretta, Ghost version. The Ghost version of Loretta is a pretty decent boss fight, especially considering the fact that it's supposed to be the weaker version. The only thing that can be a bit annoying about Loretta is her magic spam. Now I know some of you might be wondering why I'm not as upset with Ghost Loretta compared to Godfroy, even though they are both reskins of a better boss. Well, that's because Godfroy is a reskin of Godric, who is literally supposed to be a demigod, and the demigods are like the main bosses of the game. Not only that, but Ghost Loretta feels more like a clone created to guard the Carian Manor, while Godfroy is literally supposed to be another person who was a part of the Golden lineage. But instead of giving him his own unique design and moveset, they basically reused Godric. Basically what I'm trying to say is that one of them had a great excuse to be a reskin boss, while the other one felt like a lazy excuse. Blue Smelter Demon. The Blue Smelter Demon is a boss that gets severely dragged down because of the run back, and I know you might be saying that a boss fight should be judged based on the boss itself and not anything around it, and to that I have to disagree. Just a little. You see, the more annoying and frustrating the run back of the boss is, the more mentally frustrated the player is going to get while fighting that same boss. So in some ways it does affect the boss fight itself, and that's a shame because Blue Smelter is an actual decent boss fight. Sure, the arena is a bit too cramped and the hitbox can be a bit wonky at times, but other than that, he's again a pretty decent fight. Too bad he's only a copy-pasted version of another boss, which is the Red Smelter Demon. Red Smelter gets a higher place due to it having a slightly less annoying runback. Don't get me wrong, getting to his boss room is still annoying, but nothing compared to the Blue Smelter. Overall, their attack patterns are pretty much the same, so there isn't anything more to talk about. Demon of Song, another decent boss fight that gets held back by the annoying level design before it. I don't know why Dark Souls 2 was trying its hardest to gangbang the players with as much enemies as possible. That aside, the visual aspects of this boss is really cool. Like, who in their right mind came up with this design? And you gotta be high as hell to create some shit like this, and I mean that with the most respect. A human ghoul-like face with arms inside a frog's body, like what? That aside, another thing I really like is the beautiful arena. The boss fight itself is a bit lackluster as you have to wait for it to show its face in order to deal good damage, but all in all it's a pretty okay encounter mechanically, but visually it gets a 9. Vendrick. Before fighting Vendrick, I was kinda hyped because I heard he was one of the only bosses apart from Ancient Dragon to have a super high health pool. And when I went to the fight, I was kinda disappointed. His health was similar to most other bosses, but that's mostly because I already had 5 giant souls while fighting him, and if you don't know, Vendrick has an interesting mechanic where the more giant souls you have, the more damage you do to him. I wish they would include some other mechanic like that for upcoming Souls games. Now, the fight itself can be pretty tough if you don't have 5 giant souls, because if you have less, you're basically just scratching him. Now, his attacks are also deadly because even with 2300 HP, one attack was able to wipe out half of my health. But luckily, his attacks are pretty basic and easy to read. Overall, I kinda like Vendrick's fight. Sure, it's not spectacular or anything, but the lore behind it is interesting as he went from this once great king to this zombie-like creature, which is kinda ironic now that I think about it because that's literally how the last giant ended up, and they were both rivals, which is kinda crazy. And even due to the mechanics and what you need to challenge him, he's still really strong at the end of the day. Crucible Knights. The solo Crucible Knight bosses are some of the most underrated in Elden Ring, because if you put guys like this in Dark Souls 1 or 2, shit probably even 3, people would have been glazing them and placed them in their top 10 best bosses of those games, but whatever. However, while they get outshined by a lot of other bosses in Elden Ring, especially the main ones, I can definitely say that they are probably my third or second favorite field bosses. Their design looks dope, they have a lot of attacks in their arsenal that takes time to get used to but isn't too overly difficult. Now, the only thing I don't like about fighting the Crucible Knights is the fact that for how difficult they are, they don't drop a lot of runes, which makes sense since they mostly reward the player with incantations, but I think that's one of the main reasons a lot of people, including myself, wouldn't go out their way to fight them. Literally, the first Crucible Knight that's in Lingrave gives a lot of first time players as much trouble as Margit, yet he only drops around 2000 runes, but I still really like the Crucible Knight encounters, the solo ones. Commander O'Neill, a great boss held back by the annoying enemies that spawns around him. But I can at least say that taking out the enemies isn't as hard because O'Neill is very passive aggressive, meaning that he doesn't really chase you around. Fighting him on his own is pretty fun too, and his design looks cool as well. Alecto, the Black Knife Assassin ringleader. Out of all the Black Knife encounters, she's definitely the toughest one. That's because unlike most other Black Knives, she has additional attacks in her moveset and she has a pretty hefty health bar. What's crazy about Alecto is if I remember correctly, she was most likely at the forefront of the assassination of Godwyn the Golden, which is kinda awesome. Overall, she's a pretty decent boss battle. Ancestor Spirits. I don't feel like ranking them separately, so instead I'm ranking them as one. The Ancestor Spirits are beautiful looking boss fights. I don't know, there's just something cool about fighting a giant magical deer that shoots glowing nut everywhere, but this is just your typical animalistic boss. There isn't anything too special going on. Their regular moveset apart from the glowing nut looks a bit boring, but that's about it. Seath the Scaleless. Seath the Scaleless has one of the worst runback in FromSoft history, and for that I had to take away some points. Now that aside, I can at least say his arena looks beautiful, but he's somewhat easy to deal with. The best strategy is to not stand directly behind him as his tail sweep does a lot of damage, but to stand in front of him under his arms or where his weird front leg is located, because that way you can avoid most of the cursed crystals and not having to worry about his tail sweep. Now let's speak on his moveset. It's really lackluster, but I'm not gonna rip on him too much since most of Dark Souls 1 bosses, except for maybe the DLC ones, they don't really have a super complex moveset. And to be honest, I'm thankful for that because I didn't want this guide to be any harder since again the run back to this fight is painful to deal with. It's not nearly as bad as some other boss runbacks I've mentioned, but it's just super long, that's it. Overall, Seath is still a cool looking fight, and that's why he's at C tier due to me finding enjoyment of the spectacle and lore side of his encounter. Shadow Tree Avatar, while not being one of my favorites, is still definitely a spectacle to behold. I mean, the arena looks grungy but beautiful, and the design of the avatar itself looks pretty cool. Now, the fight itself isn't something I really enjoyed, mostly because I didn't really I'm not really a fan of fighting super big monster creatures, and the boss has 3 health bars, which definitely makes it feel like an endurance test at times. But all in all, I still think it's a decent boss fight, but I couldn't see myself putting it any higher. Dragonkin Soldiers. All of the Dragonkin Soldiers are badass. Their moveset, especially the one in Noxtella, looks clean as hell, and their design is top tier. It looks like a man evolving into a dragon. The one in the Scarlet Rot Lake can eat shit for all I care, but apart from that, they're all pretty cool. Aldrich, Devourer of Gods. The lore behind Aldrich is insane. He was just a deacon or priest that had an insatiable hunger for human flesh, and he began consuming people. I don't know if this is correct or not, but I think it's stated that he also ate kids as well, which is wild. He began consuming so much to the point where he became a living sludge. He died and then got revived, and now he's eating Gwendolyn alive. The boss fight itself is good for the most part, except for this annoying ass raining attack, which he spams a lot. But other than that, the fight itself is pretty okay. Nashandra. Despite Nashandra getting a lot of hate from the community, I actually somewhat like her boss fight. Sure, it's not spectacular or emotional, and for a final battle, she's kinda easy, but as for the fight itself, I think it's pretty decent. But I do hate the cursed orbs that caps your health bar. Like, come on, that shit is so annoying. And I also hate that you have to fight the Throne Watcher and Throne Defender before facing her. But that aside, another thing I really like is the fact that she traverses the fog after us, which means that technically we are the boss. Like, come on, no wonder she's so easy. And let's not forget the OST playing in the background. But overall, Nashandra gets a bit too much hate from the community, and I think she is a decent boss. Not amazing, but decent. Pursuer. I actually really like fighting the Pursuers a lot because everything about them is really cool. Their armor set and greatsword looks really badass, and speaking of armor set, why the hell can't the player wear it? Anyways, their moveset isn't the most outstanding thing in the world as their attacks are pretty easy to dodge. The only thing that will mess you up is the sometimes awkward hitbox, but apart from that, they're pretty amazing. Samurai Generals. All the generals from Sekiro, despite being copy pasted, are done right in my opinion. First of all, it kind of makes sense they're copy pasted because they are literally soldiers. Of course you're going to see them all around, and they're actually really fun to fight. Now sometimes they do have a bunch of enemies around them, but remember, this is Sekiro, so you can sneak around and can kill all of them and get critical attacks on the generals. But again, fighting them is pretty cool. The dragons. Despite people shitting on these guys, I actually kind of like fighting them. Sometimes. You see, the field dragons in Elden Ring are actually great on their own, and I want people to stop acting like they aren't, because if you place them into any other game like Dark Souls 2 or 3, people would have been glazing them hard. I mean, they're even a bit similar to Midir, except they fly away more often than him. Now, the only thing I kinda hate is the fact that most of them are reskins, and yes, I did say that I don't have a problem with reskin bosses if they make sense, and in this case they do, cause they're literally dragons, but they could have made them, a bit more interesting and gave them different movesets, not make the fights get super boring after a while, but I understand it would take a long time to do that. But still, it would make the encounters more fun. But as I said before, I think they get too much hate, that's all. Yorm the Giant. I remember seeing this big ass man running towards me and I thought I would have the hardest time ever. And that did not turn out to be the case because the Storm Ruler was sitting right there and it makes the fight a complete joke. Now despite that, Yorm is still kind of fun in a way because you have to time your charge attacks carefully or he will knock you out of the animation, but other than that, there's not much that needs to be said about this boss fight because it's pretty straightforward, but unlike others, I think it's, pretty good. Iron Golem. First off, let me just say this, the boss design is fantastic. It feels like you're fighting this giant robot, which, I don't know, I find pretty cool. Its moveset isn't too flashy or memorable except for that bullshit grab attack, but its sheer size is what I like the most. Also, I didn't know you could stagger this thing, which is pretty cool. So yeah, not much more needs to be said, it's just a decent boss fight, and that's why it's in C tier. Murgo's Wet Nurse. You know what's crazy? This is when the bosses in Bloodborne starts getting better again. And I say this because in the beginning of Bloodborne you have some amazing encounters like Father Gascoigne, Vicar Emilia, and Parl, while a lot of the other bosses were kinda mid. At least in the base game. But the wet nurse is actually really fun. I like how when you attack her it sounds like you're hitting metal, and the visual design is pretty cool too. I also like the lore behind this fight, as she's the protector of Murgo, who is an infant great one, and your whole journey was to kill it. So now you have to face her before getting to Murgo. The fight itself is also pretty cool, especially the second phase where the whole room goes dark and she summons her clone. Overall, she might not be like my favorite boss in Bloodborne, but she's definitely a good one. Old Demon King, a rather basic boss fight, but in my opinion it's done pretty well. I like the arena where you find him in, as it looks like hell itself. He also has some attacks that looks cool, but he's somewhat easy, which isn't a problem because, again, not every boss has to be hair-rippingly hard, but I feel like if he was a bit more challenging, he would be a bit more, memorable. Four Kings. This fight really humbled me a lot, to the point where I had to go and defeat the Bed of Chaos and Nido before fighting them again. The issue I was having is the amount of damage I was receiving, and the fact that I didn't have any poise didn't make it any better. But after upgrading my armor to +8 and my Estus Flask, I was able to tank a lot of their hits without worrying about receiving too much damage. Now what I realized about this fight is to stay extremely close to them, as the damage they do up close isn't as much as getting hit by the purple end of their blade. Another thing I really kinda like is the arena itself. It's just a pitch black void, and trying to get into the arena without the Ring of Artorias will get you insta-kill because of the Abyss. In essence, this is a fight a lot of people call a DPS run, as you have to hurry up and deal as much damage to them as possible and get the fuck out of there. At the end of the day, it still provides a decent challenge for the player, but if you ask me if it's one of my favorite fights, I would definitely say hell no. But not because I don't like it doesn't mean I can't really, appreciate what the devs were trying to do. Flame Lurker. This guy's one of the coolest bosses in Demon Souls, mostly because of his visuals. Now I'm not gonna lie, the PS3 design looked a bit more better than the remake, and that's because it had a more sinister and twisted look. Flame Lurker was hyped up to be one of the hardest bosses in Demon Souls, and sure, if you played the game when it first released without prior Souls knowledge, I could see that, but I was a bit surprised to find out how easy he was. Now some of his attacks, especially the ground slam, definitely has a wider hitbox, which makes dodging them a bit tricky, and he does move around a lot, but all in all, he's a pretty standard boss fight, and in my opinion, he's definitely the one top 3 bosses in Demon Souls. Gravelord Nido. Going into this fight, I was a bit over-prepared. At least that's what I thought. Honestly, if I didn't over-prepare, I don't know how I would have handled this fight. First of all, he has a bunch of respawning skeletons that deal a good amount of damage to you. Not only that, but you also take a lot of damage by dropping into his arena. And also, as soon as you drop in and try to heal, he instantly summons a blade out of the ground that deals massive damage. But I was lucky enough to be at a high enough level and having a good armor. But difficulty aside, Nido is a decent boss with a cool looking arena, and his design is, dope as well. Overall, Nido on his own is cool and all, but his skeleton minions are a bit overkill in my opinion. But at least his attacks can hurt them, so it does balance it out a bit. Bloodstarved Beast, a really hyper aggressive boss fight that can be easily cheesed. But without the cocktails, Bloodstarved Beast can be really frustrating. I remember how much of a bad time he gave me on my first playthrough, especially when he goes into poison mood, but his attacks for the most part are somewhat easy to evade because all you gotta do is just dodge to the right of all his attacks and you'll be fine. I do really like his aggression though. Vicar Emilia, one of my favorite beast-like bosses from Bloodborne. Her sheer size, presence, and aggression is the reason why I love this fight so much. Also, the screams she makes during the whole encounter is so horrifying. Now, I'm not gonna lie, this encounter does have a slight jump in difficulty, which is weird because of how early in the game she is, and she does have an annoying self-healing move, but apart from those things, Vicar Emilia is still one of the coolest bosses in Bloodborne. Osiris the Consumed King. Before I get into the boss fight itself, I just wanted to talk about the lore behind Osiris for a bit. Apparently, Osiris was once a king who was fascinated by the ancient dragons. He wanted to create a perfect heir to the thrones, so one day he was like, hey, you know what? Dragons are cool, and they're strong, so why not just transform into one, and then have a dragonborn child? He decided to transform himself into a dragon, but instead of being, quote unquote great, he looked like a crackhead, and his son Ocelot was born as a hybrid dragon, but for some reason he was invisible. During his obsession for power, he became mad and now he's here in the Garden of the Kingdom running around. Now during the boss fight, you can actually hear Ocelots crying and seeing that Osiris is actually carrying him in his arm. The encounter itself is not really anyone's favorite due to Osiris's weird instantaneous charged attacks and the fact that he moves around way too much, making fighting him with bigger weapons more of a chore. However, despite this, I really like the lore so much to the point where I placed him in mid-C tier. Sanctuary Guardian. This boss is the first encounter of the Dark Souls 1 DLC and it's good in my opinion. The design itself reminds me of some weird chimera looking creature that you would see in Greek mythology. Another thing that surprised me while fighting it is that it moves around a lot, especially compared to a lot of other bosses in Dark Souls 1. I can see this fight being super difficult if you try to fight it at lower levels, but by the time I went up against it, I was endgame level already, defeating the 4 major bosses, so you could say I was pretty confident for this fight, which is true because I was doing a lot of damage. However, the reason why I say this fight can be really tough for lower level players is because of the boss's agility. This thing does not stay still at all. You will be chasing him all over the arena only to get 1 or 2 hits in. He definitely feels like a boss that punishes tank builds, but at the end of the day I can definitely say it's one of the better bosses in the game because at least its moveset isn't bland. Calamite. I was honestly kinda scared going in to fight Calamite because I've heard so much stories about him being the hardest boss in the game, but after defeating him I kinda disagree about the whole hardest boss statement because Monos is still way harder than him. However, Calamite is still a great dragon fight and honestly, I'm impressed with him. Since he was from Dark Souls 1, a much more slower paced game. His attacks are cool, especially the eye gravity slam, and one thing I realized while fighting him is that you have to be agile. I literally had to remove my Elite Knight armor set to a much lighter one and equip the flip ring so I was mobile enough to keep up with him. Because despite his size, this guy flips around a lot and being slow and heavy isn't gonna help. But nonetheless, Calamite is a great boss fight at the end of the day, and he's definitely in my top 10 for best Dark Souls 1 bosses. 7 Ashina Spears. Man, these guys gave me such a rough time on my first playthrough, but they're some of, if not my favorite mini-boss encounters in Elden Ring. I don't know why, but there's just something so satisfying about pulling off a successful Mikiri counter. Also like how if you implement stealth properly, you can get a drop on the one in the starting area of the game. But overall, both Ashina Spears are great, even though I don't like the fact that they made the second one have another strong enemy with him. But at least you can stealth kill that said enemy. But yeah, great bosses. Commander Nile. If you asked me what was my opinion on Nile a year or 2 ago, I would have told you that he was one of the worst bosses in the entire game of Elden Ring and that he could rot in hell for all I care. And while I do believe that he should, still go rot in hell, he's definitely not one of the worst bosses in the game. Because at least now I can take down his 2 soldiers pretty quickly, making the fight way more fun. They were the main reason why I used to hate this fight so much. And to this day, they're still the main reason why I don't really like fighting him. Now, fighting Nile itself isn't on millennia levels of difficulty, but he's still somewhat challenging, mostly because he doesn't really give you a lot of time to attack him, and sure, some of his attacks are easily telegraphed, but as soon as he does one, he starts immediately attacking you before you could finish your animation. But on the spectacle side of things, he's definitely a cool looking boss fight, so I give him that. Now, it might seem weird to rank Commander Nile over the Ashina Spears, but again, in terms of visuals, that's the reason why he gets bumped up. Priscilla. First of all, if you fight Priscilla, you're automatically weird to me, but for the sake of this video, I had to. And her fight is definitely decent, but I do hate when she goes invisible because, I mean, it's not really fun fighting an invisible enemy. But overall, her attacks are decent and she makes a pretty fun boss. But the dialogue after killing her is a bit sad. Quelaag. Quelaag is a fun fight for the most part. Sure, her difficulty isn't through the roof if you fought her at the appropriate level, but she's still good regardless. Her arena is pretty neat as it feels like you're in a spider's nest. One thing I kind of find annoying is the lava her bottom half spits out all over the place, preventing you from going straight towards her at times. But overall, while her moveset isn't super complex or anything, she gets placed in C tier due to her being a good and memorable encounter. Vord of the Boreal Valley. Vord is an amazing second boss. 1, because his music goes so hard, and 2, he moves around a lot, but his attacks are also easily dodgeable. I don't have much to say about him, but he's just an amazing boss fight. That's it. Round Table Vike. one of the better NPC fights in Elden Ring. I wish Vike was given that boss encounter feeling rather than just being a buffed up player type NPC with a boss health bar. I do like his lightning attacks, but one thing I hate is the fact that for a guy wielding a big and slow weapon, his attacks will always hit you before you hit him. I don't know how to explain it. No matter how fast your weapons are and he attacks you after you attack him, his spear will always hit you before you get to hit him. I don't know, maybe I'm just bad, but other than that, I wish his boss fight was treated with more love, due to him being on the literal cover of the game. And his lore is also interesting due to the fact that he was the closest to becoming the Elden Lord before us, but he abandoned his mission to save his maiden. At least that's what I remember. Overall, he's a decent enough boss to be ranked in C tier. One Reborn. The One Reborn looks like if someone took a shit and it mutated into whatever the hell this thing is. The cutscene for this boss was actually pretty cool. Disgusting but cool. The fight itself reminds me of the Tower Knight, where you have to kill the ranged enemies on top before fighting the actual boss. But unlike the Tower Knight, this guy isn't really a gimmick and it actually puts up a fight. It has some attacks that can literally one-shot you if you aren't careful, especially the one with the raining bodies. But if you know what you're doing, this boss can be a walk in the park. Overall, I think it's a pretty decent boss. Sure, its movement is limited and it has some annoying attacks, but overall, it's still one of the better fights in the main game of Bloodborne. Erdtree avatars. Despite a lot of people hating on them, I actually really like fighting these guys, except the Scarlet Rot ones. The reason being is that they have such a simple but cool moveset, and that's kind of refreshing after fighting multiple enemies with insane combos. They're also an upgraded version of the Asylum Demon from Dark Souls 1, and come on, who doesn't love the Asylum Demon? Gyobu Oniwa. This man is underrated. He enters in by screaming his name out the top of his lungs, and he's also on an overgrown horse. Now, in terms of Sekiro main bosses, he isn't really in my top 5, but I can't deny, his fight was pretty amazing. While there isn't anything too spectacular about it, it plays well, and to be honest, that's all I want. Gyobu is one of those bosses that requires you to stay close to him, as he oftentimes retreats from the player, but thanks to the grappling hook, he can keep up to him pretty easily. Again, he doesn't have any crazy super attacks or any other cool thing in his encounter other than him riding a horse, but at the end of the day, he makes a good boss fight. Renala. First of all, let's get this out of the way. Renala's first phase, while not bad, definitely hinders the fight a lot. It's pretty similar to the Deacons of the Deep, where you have to attack the enemy with the glowing aura around them, only difference being that after killing the 3 clones with the golden aura, Renala's bubble bursts, and you have to attack her until the bubble forms around her again, and you have to repeat the process again until she runs out of health. This can be a drag if you don't have a high damaging weapon, and to be honest, as much as I like the creativity of the first phase, it's still kinda boring. Now the second phase is where everything kicks into place. Her daughter Ronnie the Witch comes in and uses her domain expansion, and now you're fighting Renala in her prime in one of the top 5 best looking boss arenas. The fight itself is pretty exciting, and I really like how they make her feel like an actual sorceress with the amount of magic attacks she has in her arsenal. Now sometimes these magic attacks, while beautiful, can be really annoying to deal with, especially since they do a lot of damage. Most times she'll just spam them continuously, and once you get close to her, she immediately summons an enemy, whether it's a dragon, a bloodhound knight, wolves, or a troll. They can definitely make the fight more annoying, but at the same time, I kinda like this because it gives a sense of difficulty for a somewhat easy boss. Just make sure you have a good amount of health while fighting her. Regular Tree Sentinels. The Tree Sentinels are some of the coolest bosses in Elden Ring, and I'm pretty sure they give a lot of players PTSD. I remember going outside for the first time, seeing one of these guys and being super overconfident, only to get my ass torn out a million times. They for sure know how to humble new players, and I kinda like that. Their design is also sick, and I'm disappointed that we won't get armor skins for Turret, because it would be awesome if we could just Turret like a Sentinel horse. Come on FromSoft, that's literally a missed opportunity right there. That aside, the Tree Sentinels doesn't really have like any attacks that are hard to dodge except for that trash ass shield bash, so all it takes for you to beat them is patience and just knowing which attacks to punish. Overall, they are what I would call a medium difficult boss fights, since their attacks are pretty easy to dodge. It's just that 1, they hit hard, and 2, the shield bash had some, weird hitbox on it. All in all, the Tree Sentinel serves as great mini bosses. Moving on, Night Cavalries. Almost the same as the Tree Sentinels, except you can knock these guys off their horses for a short time. The Night Cavalries are a bit harder since they have some attack that relies on input reading, like the jump attack, but overall my opinion on them is the same as the regular Tree Sentinels. I think they serve as, great, excellent mini bosses. Golden Godfrey. I really like Golden Godfrey because he's basically Godfrey, but on his first phase. To be honest, I'm not going to say too much about the golden version because everything I want to say about Godfrey will only be about the real version of him. But Golden Godfrey is still a great boss, even though it's a lesser version of a already great late game boss. Promised Consort Radahn. I was shitting on the second phase of Consort Radahn for a while now, so I'm just gonna change it up by just summarizing the negatives before I get into the positives. The main issue I have with Radahn is the second phase, obviously, as it's really hard to tell what's going on from all the blinding lights and the amount of times he gets stunned by one of his holy beam attacks. But all that aside, I think Consort Radahn is a decent boss at the end of the day, and I really love the first phase. But yeah, unfortunately, the second phase really made me hate this fight. Also, another thing I love is the fact that we get to fight Radahn again. I know a lot of people hated that, but me personally, I really like the fact that we, get to fight him in somewhat of his prime. It's not necessarily his prime, but you know what I mean. Great Shinobi Owl. Man, I used to hate this boss so much because the flow of combat isn't really there. Sure, both of you will be clashing and deflecting each other's attacks, but then he would throw a debuff bomb at you that will make you unable to heal for a period of time. I just think this breaks the flow of combat, and what's worse is that in his second phase, he starts throwing around poison which will limit the area to fight him. Plus, he's also constantly reducing his posture damage, and this wouldn't be an issue if the fight was short, but this fight can go up to 5 minutes, and by then you're already mentally drained. But the reason why he's at high C tier is because I've grown to somewhat like this fight. Is he my favorite boss in Sekiro? Hell no, but at least now I can appreciate it. Dark Beast Parl. Visually, Parl is one of the best looking bosses in Bloodborne. I mean, he looks like you're fighting Thor's rejected pet or something, and there's just something so unnerving about his body. Like, it's literally a walking animal skeleton, but its skull resembles a human, and there's literally no organs or anything. What's even weirder is the fact that we don't even fight him in a nightmare or a dream, so how the fuck can he even walk? You know what, I'm not gonna question the game that literally made me witness the sky giving birth. So I'm putting all that aside. In terms of difficulty, I've heard mixed reception. Some people say he's easy, and some say he's hard. Others say he's in between. But for me, he's in between. I can see if you haven't leveled up your weapon and your health, how he can easily decimate you, but if you do those things and challenge him, you will have a way better time. Meteor, Mother of Fingers. I don't really have much to say about Meteor. Sure, her arena looks beautiful, her design is interesting, and her lore is also great, as it turns out that she's not only the mother of all 2 fingers, but she's also the daughter of the greater will itself. She also has a cool looking moveset, but that's it. I don't know, I just don't really have anything much, to say about her. I guess she didn't really leave a lasting impression. Her arena is really beautiful though, like top 10 best looking boss arenas for sure. And finally, at the very top of C tier, we have everyone's favorite Omen. I'm specifically talking about Margit, not Morgott, so don't get them confused. Margit is possibly the hardest first main boss encounter in Soulsborne history. I mean, the delayed attacks, the unforgiving combos, the small window of opportunity to attack him, he is difficult, and for that, he gets a 9. But at the same time, he teaches the player an important lesson. Just explore some more. Upgrade your weapon, level up a bit, and you can come back, and sure, on your first playthrough, he still might not be an easy boss after doing all of this, but at least now he feels more manageable. Now, if you ask me if I like fighting Margit, I'm gonna have to be honest. Kinda. See, the thing is, some of Margit's attack feels a bit overtuned, especially as the first main boss of the game. Again, some of his combos just feels, weird to dodge, and sometimes he will be super still, then as soon as you try to attack him, he will immediately attack you at light speed, interrupting your animation. But at the end of the day, he's really fun, and his presentation is really good as well. But I just think he's just a tad bit overtuned. Well, other than that, I think he deserves this place as the best boss in C tier. And finally, we're finished with C tier. Honestly, the C tier bosses were still great for the most part. It's just that some of them lack the aura of being in B tier or above. But at the end of the day, they were still good. But now, let's just move on to B tier. Draconic Tree Sentinels. These guys are very similar to the original Tree Sentinels, except they are way more tough and they have lightning powers. Their lightning abilities looks awesome, but sometimes the hitbox on their charge attacks feels a bit bullshit. But overall, apart from the moveset alteration, they are pretty similar to the regular Tree Sentinels. Armored Warrior, aka Robert. Seeing this man for the first time and realizing that I don't do any physical damage to him scared the shit out of me on my first playthrough. but the more you fight him, the more you realize that the barriers on the side of the bridge can be destroyed, so it means that we have to fight him close to it. Deal enough posture damage near the cliff and he will eventually fall to his death. A gimmick boss done right. Ebrietas. Another one of Bloodborne's disgusting yet beautiful looking bosses. I mean, she looks like a mutated vagina. But as a boss fight, she is decent and surprisingly tough at the same time because she does a lot of damage, especially her laser star attack. The best way to defeat her is to stay in between her ass crack and spam R1. Now the lore behind Ebrietas is kinda sad, or I wouldn't say sad, but somewhat interesting. She's one of the only great ones that's actually really cool with humans, and she's even working with the healing church. Well, maybe working with isn't the right way to describe it because I think it's more of them forcing her to work, and she's not really defending herself. To even engage in her boss fight, you literally have to attack her first, which just proves that we are one of the villains in the story. All in all, Ebrietas provides a great challenge for players. Demon Prince. This is one of the only duo fights that gets a lot of praise from the community, and rightfully so. They are both balanced well enough not to cause any headaches. For example, their health isn't on Medeiros level, so dealing with them takes way less time. Their attacks are also surprisingly forgiving when it comes on to dodging them, so you can panic roll and you'll still most likely not get punished. And another thing I realized is that they don't do a lot of damage on their own, which again makes this fight more bearable. Now the only issue I've found with them, and I wouldn't even call this an issue, but it's basically when both of them starts attacking you at the same time. This can lead to your death if you don't position yourself properly, but luckily I've realized that the AI for which demon gets to be more aggressive changes throughout the whole fight, as sometimes one of them will just chill and shoot out poison mist while the other stays aggressive. Now that isn't the main fight, as the real fight begins after killing both demons. After killing both of them, one will resurrect as the Demon Prince, and this is where the fight gets a bit more interesting, as the Demon Prince have a bit more health and he does way more damage, especially his fire-based attacks. However, if you stay close enough and dodge his flying attacks properly, then you should be done with him in no time. Ultimately, the Demon Prince is an amazing boss fight, and while I don't like how long and drawn out it is, I think it's definitely a top tier Dark Souls 3 boss and a great Souls boss in general. Dancer of the Boreal Valley. Before going into this fight, the only thing I've heard about the dancer is how fat that ass is, and to be honest, I can't deny it. It does look good, but she was also hyped up to be one of the most difficult bosses in the main game of Dark Souls 3, and while now she isn't super hard for me because she's very passive with her attacks and it's very easy to dodge most of them, I can't deny it. On my first playthrough, she gave me a hard ass time. But difficulty aside, I really like how simple yet aura filling this whole encounter is. The way she descends from the ceiling, her giant imposing figure, and her graceful yet deadly sword sweeps, which really gives off the fact that she was actually a dancer, is what really made me love fighting her. At the end of the day, she's just a fantastic late game boss, and that's why she's in B tier. Guardian Ape. We all remembered how relieved we felt after killing the Guardian Ape on our first playthrough, only for him to wake up and start fighting again. This is probably one of my favorites second phase transition for a boss fight. Now the fight itself is okay, the arena looks nice and all, but fighting the ape in his first phase isn't something I really enjoy, since it just runs around, and deflecting the attacks is almost pointless as he does hella posture damage, which is to be expected because he's a giant ape. Plus he farts and throws shit at you, which is kinda funny to be honest. But I definitely think the second phase is where things picked up, as dodging and deflecting its sword attacks is really fun. The only thing I really hate is the constant spamming of the scream attack. That shit is one of the worst boss attacks ever, and speaking about boss attacks, check out my video on the best and worst boss attacks in Soulsborne history. Anyways, the reason why I hate this move is because it forces you to disengage with the boss by running away, and it does terror buildup which can literally insta-kill you. Other than that, I really like this boss, at least its second phase. Lady Butterfly, a very fun fight, but I wish she had more illusions other than the annoying army she summons in her second phase. I don't really have anything more to say about her. I think she's just fine and deserves to be in B tier. Mohg the Omen. Basically the first phase of Mohg the Lord of Blood, since he's just a reskinned boss fight. I'm gonna save what I have to say and leave it for the actual real boss itself. But the reason why Mohg the Omen ranks this high is because, sure, it might be a one phase fight, but it's still a good one at the end of the day. Astel, Natural Born of the Void. I remember somewhere where someone called Astel an alien butt plug, and I don't even know why I find it funny because it doesn't even look like one. Anyways, just going off of pure visuals alone, Astel gets a 9.5 out of 10. The arena looks like you're fighting him in outer space, and his design itself looks really weird but cool at the same time. For some reason, it has a human skull and have human human-like arms, but its body is like an insect from outer space. And for some reason he has eye sockets, but it's actual eyes in his skull, which leads me to believe that the alien is actually a parasite that takes over the bodies of living creatures. But visuals aside, the boss fight itself, while having some really cool looking attacks, isn't really the most fun. But again, the main reason Astel is this high is because of his visuals. Monos. Monos is a really good boss, and I was so glad that I was dealing good damage to him, because I knew if I had a shitty weapon, this fight would have took forever. He was able to get me the first couple times, but it took me 3 tries to beat him. The key is to have an armor with good poise and defense, so that if he hits you, you'll just stagger and not fall to the ground. His moveset is cool as well. He's probably the only boss in Dark Souls 1 with such a crazy move, apart from like Artorias. I mean, he even has a combo string of 4 to 5 attacks, like it's crazy. But something I didn't really like is the amount of damage he deals with his magic. It felt like he could one-shot you even if you have high amounts of health. And I also know you can use the silver pendant to avoid it, but sometimes he does the attacks so fast, reacting to them can be an issue. However, Monos is still a great fight at the end of the day, and he earns my respect as the hardest boss of Dark Souls 1. And also one of the best. Velstad. Now, some of you might be a bit mad that I rank Velstad higher than some other bosses, and the reason why he's this high is because while he may be a super easy fight and his moveset very basic, I don't know, there's just something fun about fighting him. I've mentioned before that my favorite types of bosses are humanoids that are melee focused, and he happens to fit in that category. His boss fight isn't really super crazy or anything. In his first phase, he attacks you with easily dodgeable attacks from his hammer, and in his second phase, he buffs himself to where he does more damage and takes less. But to be honest, the fight is still easy, so there's nothing to worry about. Overall, he makes an excellent boss fight despite his lack of challenge. Suralon, one of the only good bosses in Dark Souls 2 that gets held back by how shitty the runback is. But that aside, this boss fight is really amazing. Sure, some of his attacks have some weird hitboxes on them, and his moveset and attack patterns isn't too spectacular, as he mostly does an upward slice or thrust attacks. But the arena itself looks amazing, and the fight, despite the weird hitboxes, is really fun and challenging. Father Gascoigne, a superb first boss encounter, and to be honest, I wish he was placed somewhere in the mid game because I felt like he was too good to be the first boss. The first phase of Father Gascoigne is my favorite since it's a hunter versus hunter fight, but his second phase is where things get scary as he turns into a beast, and now the whole encounter feels like a horror game. He also teaches the player to stay aggressive with their opponents, which is something you definitely need to do for most Bloodborne encounters. Looking Glass Knight, one of the only visually appealing bosses in the game. First of all, the armor set looks really cool. The arena with the heavy rain makes this feel cinematic, and the fact that he has a massive mirror as a shield reminds me of some fairy tale for some reason. The boss fight itself is also pretty fun. The lightning attacks are cool, and the fact that he summons an NPC from his mirror dimension to help him fight is kinda sick, but can be a bit annoying at times. But overall, the Looking Glass Knight is an amazing boss. Putrescent Knight. The Putrescent Knight is a boss fight that I have mixed feelings on. On one hand, I love the design, the atmosphere, and the arena itself. I also like some of the attacks he has in his arsenal. Now on the other hand, he can be a bit annoying to fight. Reason being is that he barely stays in one place. His attacks has crazy range, even his regular melee ones, and he always has some sequence of combos that again gives you little room to attack him, because immediately after finishing one of his combos, he then starts another one. He's not a bad boss by any means, because if he was, he wouldn't be in B tier, but he's definitely not close to being my favorite either. Pontiff Solivan. A lot of people consider the Abyss Watchers as a first roadblock of Dark Souls 3, and while I do agree with that, I think Solivan is definitely a skill check as well. His attacks have a lot of range, and he tends to use a lot of combos. In his second phase, he can even summon a clone, which, let's be honest, it's the only reason why a lot of people struggled with him. What I find to be the best way to deal with him is to always attack when he's summoning his clone so that both of them can take damage. It's also best to focus on the clone so that killing Pontiff becomes easier. Overall, Pontiff's design and moveset makes him one of the coolest Soulsborne bosses. Godric the Grafted. Godric is one of those bosses that may not seem too important, but he became memorable due to his design and his awesome cutscenes. His moveset is also pretty interesting, as at first they seem really hard to read, but the more you fight him, the more you get used to them. But apart from attaching a dragon head onto his severed arm, he doesn't really have any spectacular moments. But this doesn't change the fact that he's an amazing boss fight. Elden Beast. So for some reason it took FromSoft 2 years to add Torrent into the Elden Beast boss fight. Why did it take so long? Who knows, but after fighting it with Torrent, the boss fight definitely felt a bit better. In my original video, I was complaining that Elden beasts kept running away from the player and that's what made the fight so unenjoyable. But with Turn keeping up with him, it's actually way easier and better now. And some of his annoying attacks like the Elden stars can be evaded way easier with Turret. Now, getting caught in them can still be a problem as Turret can get stun locked pretty easily, but it still feels somewhat nice knowing that I can't get tickled to death by the Elden stars anymore. So overall, because of Turret, Elden Beast gets a higher placing. Sister Frieda, if I'm being honest, I didn't really like Sister Frieda's boss fight all that much, and you can say it's a skill issue or whatever, but despite it being cinematic, it just goes on for far too long. The first and third stages aren't too bad, as in the first one you have to learn where to attack when she goes invisible, and this is the easiest out of all the phases. In phase 3 she starts using Black Flame and she becomes way more nimble, which is cool, but at the same time I really hate how little window of attack opportunity she gives the player, as she's always dashing around as soon as you land a hit on her. So if you have a weapon that relies on constant attacking, then she's gonna give you a super hard time. Now my real issue comes with her second phase. Don't get me wrong, the cutscene with her and Father Ariando looks cool and all, but I think it was just added to draw out the fight a bit, which sucks because when you reach her third phase, you probably don't have a lot of Estus left, and now she's way harder and faster than before. If it wasn't for her second phase and how unnecessarily fast she was in her third phase, I would have placed her much higher, but overall, I'm just not a big fan at all. But I can at least appreciate the amazing visuals. Penetrator. First of all, that's one crazy ass name, not gonna lie. And second of all, for a guy called the Penetrator, he barely has any penetrating attacks. The reason why the Penetrator ranks this high is because he's a fun boss. Sure, he's piss easy, but that doesn't take away from the fun aspects of the encounter. His armor design is also cool, and it's a shame that you had to pre-order the game in order to get it in the remake. Old King Alon. For how gimmicky and forgetful the bosses are in Demon Souls, it may come to a surprise that both the Penetrator and the Old King ranks this high in a Soulsborne boss ranking video. But the Old King himself is a great final boss, and no, the true king doesn't count. Everything about this boss fight feels cinematic, whether it's just the aura he gives off or the various wind-based attacks he has. He even manages to feel more like a final boss compared to Nashandra from Dark Souls 2. And sure, while he isn't super hard now, since most of us have already played other Souls games before, I can only imagine having to fight this guy on the PS3 version when it just released. Difficulty aside, everything about the Old King makes him a good boss fight. Dragon Slayer armor, another purely melee based boss fight that I really love. This thing is definitely the most underrated boss fight in the entire game. I mean, its aggression and its attack patterns are what I truly love about it, but the annoying ass flying enemies can definitely ruin the fight when they start shooting projectiles at you, but that aside, the Dragon Slayer armor is a fantastic boss fight. Champion Gundyr. Speaking of aggressive boss fights, Champion Gundyr is the definition of that. This man will not let you breathe for a second without kicking you, shoulder checking, and bashing you into the ground. It's like he heard us making fun of him in the tutorial and knew that he had to lock in. Now I know that doesn't make sense since you're technically fighting the past version of him, but it doesn't really matter. The fight itself is really cool and challenging. Logarius. One of the harder fights in the main game of Bloodborne. Martyr Logarius is a great fight because it provides a good challenge for players. His cursed magic attacks looks amazing, and I like how you're fighting him on top of a castle. I just like this boss fight so much, even though he can be a pain in the ass sometimes. Divine Dragon. The Divine Dragon is a perfect example of why a boss doesn't always have to be hard for it to be good. And I know what some of you might be saying. Well, the gameplay of this boss fight is boring. And to that I disagree. Sure, it may be a gimmick fight that doesn't rely on you deflecting in order to succeed, but in my opinion, it's a satisfying fight. First of all, the visuals of the dragon is simple yet beautiful. The arena itself is also spectacular because it makes you feel like you're actually in one of those old Japanese folklore artworks. It's like you're in some sort of heavenly realm. And the fight itself consists of you grappling to the roots where the lightning is and redirecting it back to the dragon, and this is how you do damage. While this isn't hard, it's kind of satisfying to pull off, and let's not forget how great the dragon's attacks are visually. Everything about this boss fight is beautiful, and in terms of difficulty, it might get a 2 out of 10, but in terms of visuals, it gets a 10. Ancient Dragon Lanciax. This is gonna sound a bit strange, but I think Lanciax is slightly better than Fortisax when it comes down to their attack pattern. And there's two reasons why this comes off as strange and confusing, because one, I ranked her spot first, so that means that Fortisax must have a higher ranking, and two, they both share the exact same moveset, kinda. Now the reason why I say in terms of moveset and attacks gets the dub is because Fortisax has that one annoying lightning tracking attack that he spams every second of the fight, but Lanciax doesn't have that, which is cool. But in terms of everything else, while I do like Lance, she just doesn't share the same type of aura that, Fortisacs have. Now, the reason why she ranks in B tier is because she's one of the only open world bosses that doesn't feel like a copy paste, even though she kinda technically is, but it doesn't matter because we encounter her first. If it seems like I don't really have much to say about her, well that's the case. Everything I want to say about Lance CX is gonna be saved for Fortisacs, since they technically share the same moveset, and he's kind of the cooler boss. But overall, she's still an amazing encounter, especially as a field boss. Burnt Ivory King. Before I get into this fight, I just wanted to mention how much I don't like the first phase of this. Sure, I get what the devs were trying to do, but I think it draws the fight for way too long. They could have made it have way less enemies, or at least make them easier to kill. Not saying that they're hard or anything, but when I went back to fight them, they had a surprising amount of health. Maybe it was because I was on New Game Plus for that specific area, but I don't know. Now, something I really like is the entrance to the arena. It feels like you're falling into hell itself to face this great foe. And I really like the idea of gathering other people to help you fight a boss. Now let's talk about the Ivory King himself. He's okay. His moveset in the first phase isn't hard to dodge, but it can be a bit tricky when he turns his sword into a 20-foot long lightsaber. I realize that sometimes the hitbox can be a bit janky on it, especially with certain attacks. Other than that, I think he's a fun boss, and while I hate the first phase with the enemies, I still like the second phase enough to ignore that. Rykard gets top place in A tier for being one of the scariest looking bosses in FromSoft history, and that's kinda odd because we've seen a bit more horrifying bosses like the Gaping Dragon and the entirety of Bloodborne's beast and alien bosses, but there's just something different about Rykard. Well, I guess it's just the messed up looking face, the fact that he's also a giant snake, and also his evil raspy voice. But all that aside, in terms of visuals, he gets a 10 out of 10. But you can't tell me FromSoft wasn't on that while designing Rykard. I mean, who the hell just thinks of this? And speaking of hell, the arena makes it feel like you're fighting him there as well, especially in his second phase. Now, in terms of gameplay, this is technically a gimmick fight since you need a special weapon in order to defeat him, just like Yorm or Storm King. However, what makes Rykard way better than those guys is the fact that we get has regular attacks, except they generate wind. So it's not like you have to hold down a button waiting for your weapon to charge up just to attack the boss. No, all you need to do is just fight Rykard just like how you would do with any other boss in the game. And that's what makes him so fun. Genichiro Way of Tomoe. It's basically the same fight as third phase Genichiro, except instead of using lightning attacks, he uses the Black Mortal Blade. But overall, it's just Genichiro with an additional attack. Nothing too crazy. Still a mechanically fun boss fight though. Moon Presence. The Moon Presence has a really cool design, and it also has one of the best intro cutscenes. Now, to fight the Moon Presence, you have to consume 3 umbilical cords of a great one. And yes, that sounds nasty as hell, and after consuming them, you have to tell Gearman to F off and kill him. And then the Moon Presence will come down to consume you, but since you ate the umbilical cords, you will repel it, and now it wants to kill you. Fortunately for us, the Moon Presence is a somewhat easy boss fight. I mean, there isn't anything too crazy going on here. He fights like a regular beast type enemy, and the only scary attack it has is when he uses his Sharingan and your health goes all the way down to 1%. Now, while that might seem OP and busted, this attack staggers the Moon Presence for a couple seconds, giving you enough time to heal up and attack it to regain health. As much as I like the Moon Presence, I just wish they changed up the arena a little bit, or at least give him some cooler attacks. But again, I still like the Moon Presence, and I think it's an amazing boss fight. Emma the Gentle Blade. There's nothing gentle about her blade. This woman will literally throw you into the air and slam you into the ground like you're a small child, which surprised even me because I was not expecting that from someone with such a small frame. I mean, she's even shorter than Wolf, and almost every boss towers over him. Now, her actual boss fight itself is really good despite how short it is. She has some attacks that's easily deflected, and that's about it. She doesn't really have any special fire or lightning abilities, nor does she have any weird ninjutsu skills. She's just a sword-wielding baddie, and despite not having any of those things, she plays her part well as the first phase of a different boss. And before I move on, I know some of you might be wondering why I counted Emma separately from Ish and Ashina, but not Radagon and Elden Beast. Well, it's because Emma and Ishin shows up as separate bosses in the Reflections of Strength, so yeah. Royal Knight Loretta. She makes a great horseman fight, and to be honest, she's probably the best out of all of them. Her magic attacks looks cool. Sure, they can be a bit annoying to deal with at times, but they're still cool to look at. Her boss fight itself is pretty similar to other horsemen with some changes, so there's not much that needs to be said. She's an overall amazing and engaging boss fight. Elamar of the Briar and Bell-Bearing Hunters. All of the bell-bearing hunters takes a spot. Out of all the mini-bosses in Elden Ring, they're definitely my favorite. Your attacks are cool and you have to be super careful with the way you dodge them. I also like the telekinesis they use while attacking you, and speaking of telekinesis, they force you to stay close to them and attack with caution, because if you R1 spam these guys, they're gonna instantly hit you with an unsuspecting attack, causing you to panic roll away to heal, only for them to use their telekinesis to swing their sword from across the room and kill you. It's the perfect balance of challenge and fun, and that's why for just mere mini bosses they rank in the top 30. Fume Knight takes the highest spot in B tier due to him being a genuinely fun boss fight and one of the only redeeming things in the accursed mess known as Dark Souls 2. Okay, I'm just joking. Okay, I'm not. Fume Knight makes a great boss fight because his arena, while a bit dull, fits his character. His armor and sword looks really cool, and his moveset, while simple, have some cool looking visuals to them. He's a great example of how simplicity can make a boss fight enjoyable, but despite how simple he is, the fight itself can be challenging due to him being super aggressive with his input reading. I mean, trying to heal successfully in front of this man is basically a challenge in of itself, but despite that, he's still my favorite boss from Dark Souls 2. And that's the end of B tier. As you can tell, a lot of these bosses were really amazing and didn't disappoint at all. Now it's time to go into A tier. But we have the fan favorite, Ornstein and Smough. Some people may consider this a controversial placement since they're not in the top 10, but compared to the other bosses, I think it's fair to place them here. At first, I never really saw the hype for ONS, but after refighting them, I realized that they are actually a really good boss fight, and they both complement each other really well. Ornstein being the fast and nimble one, while Smough being the big and slow but heavy hitting one. I find this fight easier if you take out Ornstein first and leave Smough for last, because during the second phase, one of them gets souped up, and Super Smough is definitely the easier one to handle. His attacks basically remains the same, except he will do this ass slime attack that can do a lot of damage if you get caught. Overall, as much as I love this fight, I also hate it as well due to FromSoft trying their best to replicate the aura that these two had. However, none of their dual bosses in the future aren't balanced as well as Ornstein and Smough, except for the Demon Prince, and that's a shame. Corrupted Monk, the ghost version of the true monk. While being the exact same as the true corrupted monk, it has one main mechanic that makes it different. For example, the corrupted monk's posture recovers much more quickly compared to the true monk. But to counteract this, you can use Snap Seeds, which stuns the monk for a couple seconds and dealing posture damage. Fighting this boss is also really fun since it has a bunch of attacks that are satisfying to deflect and counter. Overall, it's a great boss, but the true corrupted monk is obviously gonna rank higher since it's a complete version of this fight. Great Grey Wolf Sith. I know Sith may not be the hardest boss in Dark Souls 1, but again, I did mention that a boss doesn't have to be hard to be good, and Sith is another perfect example of that. Sith is an amazing boss with great but sad lore. Being the pet of the legendary knight Artorias, you would expect Sith to put up a fight, and that's not really the case cause he's kinda easy, but that's not a bad thing. His moveset isn't unbearable, and I'm glad for that because, I mean, look at the size of this thing. If it was zooming around the map, it would be a nightmare to fight, especially with the slower paced combat of Dark Souls 1. During the first phase, Sith dishes out regular sword swings and it's best to stay under him, but what I find somewhat interesting is that during his second phase, instead of getting a power up and becoming stronger or faster, Sith starts hopping around and his sword swings gets much slower. And you can tell he's hurt badly because sometimes he will fall while trying to attack you. What makes Sith so interesting in the first place is that you can tell Sith doesn't want to fight you, but he has to prevent you from becoming just like Artorias. Like, come on bro, this is the type of shit that will make a grown man cry. But overall, Sith is a great fight with a super deep lore, and that's why he gets the spot. Romina, Saint of the Bud. A very beautifully presented boss fight. All she's missing is a cutscene, but apart from that, her design is great, her attacks looks beautiful, her lore is intriguing, and she's a blade wielding baddie. So of course I'm gonna rank her pretty high on the list. So yeah, overall she's just a fun fight too. Star Scourge Radahn. Radahn was a boss that had a lot of build up pre-release. First of all, he was in the first ever reveal trailer for Elden Ring and everyone thought he was a troll-like creature. Then we saw him in the story trailer and he looked badass. So I was truly excited to fight him, and man, he did not disappoint. Everything about his boss fight feels like a spectacle, from the amount of people that can be summoned to challenge him, the arena that looks like a war zone, and the imposing figure of Radahn himself. And let's not forget his second phase transition, which is definitely like top 3 best Soulsborne transitions of all time. The fight itself is also really challenging as he hits like a truck. He also has a crazy amount of chained attacks. Now in the second phase he pulls out some floating rocks, and those things used to insta kill me on my first playthrough, but now I know how to counter them. He also has some additional gravity attacks that looks cool, especially the one where he flies up into the air and turns into a drill. Again, everything about his boss fight is great, but I do feel like a lot of the spectacle is gone after the first playthrough. And sure, you can say that about any boss, but Radahn, while still good, isn't the boss that I'm super excited to fight on subsequent playthroughs. And that doesn't mean he's bad or anything, it's just that I find some other bosses more fun to fight. But again, Radahn is still an excellent boss fight at the end of the day, and he definitely deserves to be an A tier. Mohg, the Lord of Blood. Mohg. Where do I even begin? I do like the first phase of this fight a bit more than the second one, and that's because in his second phase I feel like there's too much going on. First of all, he flies all over the arena, does insane chain attacks, throws blood fire all over the floor, so you have to be careful where you step, and he barely gives you any chance to attack him. If it's one thing I genuinely hate about the Elden Ring bosses, it's the fact that they have some insane chains of attacks, and once they're finished with those set attacks, you only have a split second to hit them. And you can say this is to prevent R1 spamming, but there's been bosses that does insane combos but still gives the player a chance to attack them multiple times without said player spamming R1. And while I do like the visual aesthetics of Mohg's second phase, again I just think it's too much at times, especially with his transition. The fact that it requires you to get another item to use in order to not lose any health is kinda bullshit. And I know some people love the fact that they have to use up some of their Estus flags in this transition because it adds challenge, but personally I think it's just not needed. However, despite the negative stuff, I do really love Mohg's boss fight a lot. If I didn't, he wouldn't even rank this high, so there's definitely enjoyment to fighting him. True Corrupted Monk. One of my favorite bosses in Sekiro. The monk's first phase is similar to the previous version, which is the Corrupted Monk, however she now has 3 phases instead of 1. Her first phase remains the same, but it's the other 2 that's different. Her second phase moveset remains the same as the first, except now she summons a bunch of clones that attacks you consecutively. And in her third, she grows out a centipede which can puke on you, causing terror buildup, which can get pretty annoying at times. But overall, her design, the beautiful arena, and the combat flow is why I rank her so high on this list. Owl Father. This is the better version of the actual Owl boss fight in the main story, because unlike that version, this guy actually fights you head on. His moveset is actually really good too, especially the fiery bird projectile followed by the sword thrust. The only move that can be somewhat annoying to deal with is when he turns into an owl and you can't lock on, and out of nowhere he will try to sneak attack you. For this, it's best to move the camera in the direction of the owl so it can be easier to deflect his attack. But boss fight aside, the lore behind this particular fight is really good. Remember the fight you had with Lady Butterfly and then immediately afterwards you got killed? Well, it turns out that he is the one that killed you that night, and now you're fighting that version of him. Now the only issue with his boss fight is that he has a lot of posture, so the fight can be a bit of a drag. But other than that, he makes an excellent boss fight. Placidusax. Fucking hell, that name. One of my all-time favorite dragon bosses. The pure aura that this thing gives off is crazy. It's like you're fighting an ancient deity, which is technically what he is, but that's beside the point. The fight itself is pretty cool visually, mostly because of the red lightning and some other attacks like the double laser beam and the nuke. Now he gets a lot of criticism when it comes on to his lack of body movement, and while I kinda agree to some extent, I think his overall attack patterns make up for that, as he's still mobile but he just teleports a lot. Flaccid ball sacks at the end of the day still makes a great dragon fight. Baal the Dread. Baal is a decent dragon boss. You see, I've never been a super fan of dragon fights in the Soul series, mostly because spectacle aside, they're not all that fun, at least in my opinion. But putting that personal dislike aside, I can at least appreciate what they were going for. First of all, the build up to Baal is probably the best build up to a boss in the entire Soulsborne franchise. I mean, Jagged Peak is definitely one of the best areas in the entire game. His design and lore is also great, as it's stated that he attacked Placidusax way back in the day, and that's the reason why he's missing his leg and wings. His moveset is also stunning, but I do hate the fact that he moves around a lot, giving you barely any chance to attack him. All that aside, Baal is still one of the best dragon fights in Soul history. Next up we have Fortisax. Now the reason why I enjoy fighting Fortisax is because of his arena, his flashy moveset, and his overall dragon-like behavior. That's it, moving on. Dark Eater Midir. Another excellent dragon fight, and some would consider him to be the best dragon boss in all Soulsborne history, and I kinda agree with that. His His difficulty is insane as he deals a lot of damage and he has a lot of health. If I'm not mistaken, he's probably the only non-gimmick boss to have this amount of health in Dark Souls 3. His attacks are very feral and more animalistic compared to Dragon Lord, who attacks you with a more strategic approach. A great example of this is the dope ass beam attack that he uses as a last ditch effort to kill you. Now the reason why he ranks higher than Dragon Lord and Fortisax is because he has more mobility and fights a bit more aggressively than both of them. So yeah. Next up we have the Abyss Watchers. These guys were my first roadblock in Dark Souls 3, and that's because they're super aggressive. And they're technically a gang fight, however unlike most gang fights they're actually super balanced. Because while they may be super aggressive, they don't have a lot of health, which makes the fight goes by smoother. And not only that, but a third Abyss Watcher will wake up and fight the other two with you. But the real fight starts in the second phase as the final Watcher uses his other friend's essence to power himself up, and now his sword is engulfed in flames. In this phase he's even more aggressive than before, and also he has way more range, but fortunately his health is surprisingly low, which makes the fight a lot easier. Ultimately, the Abyss Watchers are some of the best Soulsborne bosses ever. Demon of Hatred. I used to hate this guy so much because I thought he felt more like a Dark Souls or a Bloodborne boss that got thrown into Sekiro, and I also used to complain about him not following the core mechanics of what makes a Sekiro boss fight great, and now looking back, I'm actually disappointed in myself for thinking like this. And I think sometimes me and a lot of other players jump to conclusion about certain bosses without trying to get better or at least understand the mechanics behind them, because now my opinion on the Demon of Hatred has changed. He's now my third favorite Sekiro boss. But don't get me wrong, some boss fights can still remain bad even after understanding the mechanics, but the Demon of Hatred is not one of those boss fights. Despite deflection not playing a super big part in the combat flow, he still requires an understanding of other mechanics, such as knowing when to jump over certain attacks, knowing when to run away and grapple at the right time to close back some distance. He's an amazing boss fight, and the lore and story behind him is interesting and somewhat sad at the same time. Gwyn, the Lord of Cinder. On my most recent playthrough, I was really excited to fight Gwyn, but I was left kinda disappointed at the end. I realized that maybe the build I had was a bit too powerful, or maybe it was just Gwyn who was weak, but despite him being a pushover, the essence of the fight is what made me rank him this high. Gwyn has a fiery moveset and his jump attacks looks dope. Let's not forget the lore behind him as well, and the amazing boss arena. Speaking of arena, I really like the view of approaching his boss room. Sure, is it too long? Yes. Are there too much Black Knights? Also yes, but the view and aura of the scenery is still amazing. Speaking of aura, let's talk about Gwyn's. You can tell that this man was once a powerful being that got hollowed to the point of being a mere musk of his former self, due to him tending the flame for such a long time. This might have been the reason why Gwyn was so easy. It's to show that this man is far out of his prime. At the end of the day, he's still a really amazing boss fight and a great ending to Dark Souls 1. Artorias. This was my most anticipated fight of my Dark Souls 1 run, and it didn't disappoint at all. He has a cool moveset and his lore is also amazing. One thing I do hate is the triple head overslam attack that he does, but my health was good so it didn't bother me too much. But yeah, Artorias is just an amazing boss fight, and I don't know if I said this already, but I really like sword or blade wielding bosses, so that's why he ranks this high. Divine Beast Dancing Lion. The Dancing Lion is one of the most interesting looking bosses in the game. The fact that it's two guys in a costume doing a ritual dance makes it funny and somewhat terrifying at the same time. The moveset on the Divine Beast is also interesting, as it's really hard to read some of its attacks, which makes the fight hard as hell since it's also very fast. Speaking about fast, because of its speed and constant movement, you will oftentimes die to the awkward camera angles, which is definitely frustrating as hell. Now throughout the different phases of the fight, the lion changes its elemental attacks from wind to lightning to frost. Overall, this is definitely a great boss encounter, and that's why it's at this spot. Lothric and Lorien, twin princes. I forgot how good this boss fight was until my recent playthrough of Dark Souls 3. I'm surprised not a lot of people talk about them. I mean, everything about their boss fight is just so engaging and fun. Their attacks are pretty cool, especially the teleportation, and I like how in the second phase you have to kill Lothric, as if you don't, he will keep reviving Lorien. This is another underrated boss fight for sure, and it deserves way more love. Orphan of Cause, the second hardest boss in FromSoft history. The Orphan of Cause has some really awesome looking attacks, and it's nimble and aggressive enough to give the player a hard time. Apart from its aggression and mobile nature, what really makes this fight hard is the fact that he has a surprising amount of health, which is weird because he's technically a newborn. Overall, the Orphan is a great fight with great lore behind it. Ludwig the Holy Blade. Ludwig from Bloodborne is a great boss fight because it combines challenging gameplay with a deep, airy atmosphere. I really like both phases of this boss fight. In the first phase, you're facing a wild, monstrous creature, then in the second, he transitions to a more human-like boss, now wielding the Moonlight Greatsword. The fight is great because it tests the player's skills and adaptability, making it super memorable. Additionally, the music and environment adds to the intensity, creating a fantastic experience. Now, the only thing I don't like about his encounter is the weird jump attack he has in his first phase, but at the end of the day, he's an absolutely great boss. Rellana. Rellana has officially become one of my favorite bosses in Elden Ring. She has a cool looking moveset, her armor looks great and it's my personal favorite armor in the game, and her arena is also beautiful. Now, some of you may think that the only reason why she ranks this high is because of recency bias. Well, that's not true, because I really like humanoid blade wielding bosses a lot, and she happens to fit that category. Now, don't get me wrong though, there are some things that I definitely hate about this boss. First of all, I hate how she barely staggers at all. And by this, I'm not talking about her breaking her stance, but it's just that every time you hit her, you'd expect her to be stunned after each hit, especially when you're using a big weapon. But for some reason, she has a crazy amount of hyper armor and poise. Shit, even Malenia can get stunned pretty easily when hitting her with a big weapon. The other thing I don't really like about her is the jump in difficulty she has compared to the first boss of the DLC, and the fact that she doesn't have any cutscene. But apart from all of that, she's still amazing, and that's why she's at this spot. Malekith the Black Blade. Malekith is one of the best bosses in Elden Ring, and he's in my personal top 5. His attacks are wild, yet with careful timing you can dodge them properly, except for the attack where he slams his blade into the ground and it does that flurry thing. To this day I still can't dodge that. The thing that makes Malekith a challenging boss is the fact that his attacks cap your health for a short duration of time. He's also super agile, which makes fighting him with a slow weapon really difficult. His design is really cool as well. The only downside to his boss fight is the first phase and that one flurry attack, but overall he's definitely one of the best Soulsborne bosses, and I can honestly understand if some people place him as their #1 favorite. Ishin Ashina. Ishin Ashina from Sekiro is an excellent boss fight because it perfectly blends challenge, skill, and storytelling. In order to even fight this man, you would have to choose to help your father and forsake Kuro, which makes Ashina even in old age come out to challenge you. Now, the boss fight itself is challenging but satisfying at the same time. I remember hearing people say that most of Sekiro's boss fight feels like a dance, and this is so true, and it also applies to Ishin. His attacks are satisfying to deflect, and he even punishes you if you become too greedy. His second phase is where he dials things up to 11, as he can now control the flames that was on the floor, making you having to position yourself where the fire hasn't affected. He also has some other dangerous fire-based attacks that requires proper dodge timing. Overall, in terms of difficulty, he gets a 9.5, and in terms of balance and overall fun factor, he gets a solid 10, the Nameless King. This man was considered to be the second hardest boss at the time of Dark Souls 3 release, and while some other bosses have taken that spot over the years, this man still provides a great challenge for newcomers, mostly because of his aggressive nature. He's one of the only bosses in Dark Souls 3 that really punishes R1 spamming, so it's always best to time your attacks properly. The only downside to this fight is the first phase. Not saying it's bad, but the second phase steals the spotlight. All in all, Nameless King truly deserves this spot. Morgott the Omen King. He's the best mid-game boss fight that FromSoft has ever made. His attacks are dynamic and cool, especially the raining swords, and in my opinion, all his attacks are a bit easier to read than Margit's. In his second phase, the whole arena gets engulfed in literal shit, and now he covers his sword in cursed blood. Everything about Morgott is amazing. The lore, the boss fight itself, and the build up to him is amazing. Medra, Lord of Frenzied Flame. The visual design of Medra is awesome. I've talked about this in a different video. The glowing head, the ragged robe, and the aesthetics of the Frenzied Flame itself really makes me love this boss fight. But what made me place it this high on the list is because of the fight itself. His moveset is super fair as he barely does any long combos, and he gives you enough time to punish him, but because of this, he hits really hard. Like really hard. If you aren't at a good shadow fragment level, he will basically two-shot you. He's just a great boss. period. Godfrey / Horaloo. Godfrey's boss fight is legendary in my opinion, due to the sheer amount of aura this man has. I mean, the fight itself is really good due to his complex yet simple attack chains, and let's not forget his awesome second phase cutscene where he rips off the head of his lion just so he could get stronger. Like, that's some crazy shit right there. Another thing I like is his grappling attacks in his second phase. Now, the only negatives I have is that Godfrey, or should I say Horaloo, in his second phase might be a bit too aggressive. I mean, you barely get any chance to heal around this guy. But then again, maybe that would have made the fight too easy. But overall, in terms of fun and balance, Godfrey gets a 9 and he deserves the spot. Melania. Man, where do I even start? This woman has caused a great shift within the Soulsborne community and the gaming community as a whole due to how difficult she is. First of all, she was the poster girl for the game, and many including myself were excited to encounter her, and after doing so, many people had different opinions on her. On one hand, you have some players praising her design, atmosphere, intriguing lore, and challenging moveset, while on the other, some people agree that while her overall visuals are cool, she is a bit overtuned, due to her ability to self-heal on every attack, whether you block them or not, her awkward hyper armor, and her infamous waterfall dance attack. This attack alone takes Melania from an already difficult boss fight to an almost unfair one. I've never seen an attack that gets so much views on YouTube just because people couldn't dodge it properly. It's literally up there as one of the most infamous attacks in gaming history due to how hard it is to dodge and how much damage it does. The first flurry of the attack can wipe out your entire health bar in a split second, and to be honest, I understand why people think this attack is bullshit. I mean, she literally does it out of nowhere without any build up, and when she jumps into the air, she only gives you like 1 second to run away and dodge the attack. Sure, it's been 2 years and I'm pretty sure there's been a lot of people who found ways to counter this attack with no issue, whether it's using freezing pots or just evading it in a strategic manner. But despite this, I can still say that this move alone ruins the enjoyment factor of this boss. Due to the unpredictable nature of it, most players will find themselves trying to bait out the attack so that it won't catch them off guard, and this can get pretty annoying, ruining the flow of the fight, especially in her second phase, because for some reason it's even harder to tell whether or not she's going to be doing the waterfall dance. Now, I don't just want to focus on the negatives here, because as you can see, out of all the hundreds of bosses FromSoft has ever made, she ends up making it in the top 10. And I didn't place her here just because I thought people would be mad if I placed her any lower. No, it's literally because in recent times I've generally come to enjoy fighting her, mostly because I've learned how to dodge the waterfowl dance. But even before that, there was something special about Melania, because deep down I could tell that she's an excellent fight, only hindered by one big flaw. And again, the reasons why I love this fight is similar to why people like it. Her visual design is cool as hell. I mean, she looks like a Valkyrie warrior. The flowing red hair, the golden prosthetics, and in her second phase, her design gets dialed all the way up. She's now naked, but instead of it coming off as, you know, the devs being horny or whatever, it instead comes off in a way that makes sense, since she's now fully giving herself to the rot. It's almost like she's given a rebirth. Now, in her second phase, she has wings that's fused with her hair, and she has butterflies emerging from those said wings. You can tell from this transformation that she doesn't care about her appearance, as her only duty is to now defeat you. Speaking of transformation, that second phase cutscene is one of the best I've ever seen. Now, in terms of combat, despite having 2 bullshit attacks, her basic attacks are surprisingly easy to dodge and punish. Also, side note, did you know that she can actually like deflect some of your attacks? All in all, Melania is a great fight that has grown on me in the past couple months, despite me hating it at first, and if it wasn't for that specific attack, she would have been in the top 3 for sure. Genichiro Ashina. To no one's surprise, the Sekiro boss makes it this high on the list, and that's because most of Sekiro bosses are well balanced and some have fun elements to them, except for a small amount. But overall, they are pretty good, and Genichiro Ashina is one of them. His inner version is a bit more fun to fight, and that's because he has some cooler additional attacks, but the regular version still makes a good boss. The reason why I rank him higher than all other Sekiro bosses I've mentioned so far is because he requires you to use whatever skills you've learned while playing the game and use them against him, whether it's just basic deflection, Mikiri counter, lightning reversal, or just jumping over certain attacks. He manages to let the player utilize these skills in a challenging but fun manner. The only thing I can say that kinda gets annoying about fighting him is when he shoots his arrows at you, but even then it's only a slight annoyance. Overall, Genichiro's boss fight is one of the best, so that's why he's at 6th place. However, there are more bosses that I think are better than him, or at least more fun than him in my opinion. and one of these bosses happens to be from the same game. Now finally, let's move on to S tier. These are the best of the best. These bosses are literally the Mount Rushmore of Souls bosses, and they're in my personal top 6 so far. Gehrman the First Hunter. Let's be honest, when we saw Gehrman get up from his wheelchair and pull out his badass scythe, we all got hyped, especially because throughout the whole main game of Bloodborne, we all just thought he was just a regular old man that couldn't even hurt a fly, only to find out that he was literally the first hunter to ever exist, and a badass one at that. The fight with Gehrman itself is pretty good because of two reasons. One, obviously the fight itself, and two, the story and lore behind it. Let's talk about the fight. Just like you, Gehrman is a hunter, and because of this he's extremely fast and nimble and has some trick up his sleeves. Speaking of tricks, he also uses a trick weapon that can be used as a regular sword or a scythe when transformed, and he also wields a blunderbuss. Now the first phase is pretty regular as he switches between the scythe and the sword. Personally, I think it's easier to deal with the sword version because the attacks are easier to dodge, but his blunderbuss can catch you off guard while attacking him, which leads to you getting stunned. Now in his second phase, he powers up with Moon Essence and he gains additional AoE attacks, and he's even much more faster now. The battle between you and him feels great because it's almost like you're fighting your equal. Now the second reason why I like his boss fight is because of the story behind it. Gehrman was a hunter that participated in the fishing hamlet massacre that resulted in the death of a great one. Accompanying him on the massacre was Lady Maria, who eventually took her own life due to the guilt she felt for participating in this slaughter. Because of her death, Gehrman was now very depressed, and he even created a doll to resemble Maria, and made a deal with the Great One, which is the moon presence, to revive Maria in the form of the doll. His wish was granted, but now he was trapped inside the hunter's dream for eternity, and he grew to hate the doll because while she was sentient and had some of Maria's personality, at the end of the day, she was not her. Now, fighting Gehrman is basically giving him a chance to leave this endless dream once and for all, and the reason why he's fighting back is because he most likely doesn't want you to end up in the same position as him. So in a weird way, both of you are fighting to help each other. All in all, Gehrman is an excellent boss, and that's why he's in my personal top 5. The Soul of Cinder. The Soul of Cinder provides a fantastic ending to the base game of Dark Souls 3, mostly because of his awesome design, fun boss fight, and cool arena. I remember someone saying that if a boss fight takes place in a floor field in a FromSoft game, it's gonna be top tier, and honestly, they're not lying. The design of the Soul of Cinder is also great. I mean, the fire burns on his old looking armor and the coiled sword looks awesome. I don't know, it's just everything about the Soul of Cinder is beautiful, and let's not forget the awesome OST playing in the background, especially when it reaches the second phase and Gwyn's theme starts playing. Hearing this getting played must have felt so nostalgic for players that played Dark Souls 1 first. Fighting the Soul of Cinder is also fun as his combat style changes throughout the whole encounter. He starts by using his weapon as a regular sword, and throughout the fight he uses it as a spear and a magic staff. All in all, he's just a good boss. That's it. Lady Maria. She's a great boss. There's a lot of stuff I love about her. Her moveset is clean, well, not really because she uses blood, but you know what I mean. Her attacks are cool visually, especially in her second phase when she uses Blood Flame and she gets way faster. The lore behind her boss fight is amazing as well, as after she took her own life, she ended up in the Hunter's Nightmare, opposite of the Hunter's Dream. This is where the hunters who are blood drunk ends up, especially the ones that helped in the massacre of the fishing hamlet. And now you have to fight Maria, who's trying to hide the truth of what really happened. Just a masterpiece of a boss fight, and you can't go wrong with giving a fine ass baddie a sword and calling it a boss fight. Mesmer the Impaler. Mesmer now has a special place in my heart as he's so good to the point where I decided not to place him in A tier but S tier over Lady Maria. I know, that's crazy coming from the #1 Lady Maria fan, but I'm a fair person at the end of the day, and I decided that it would have felt wrong if I didn't place him here at 3rd place. His boss fight is just so fun. I mean, at first his attacks and combos felt unforgiving, but even on my first playthrough, he didn't feel unfair. I knew that each time I died, it was my own fault, whether I got too greedy with my attacks or I wasn't timing my dodges properly. But once you know the patterns to his attacks, dodging him feels super fun. Especially the second phase, which is the easier phase if you time your dodges correctly. His aesthetics and visual design is a major factor on why I placed him here as well. His lore is also super interesting too, since he was most likely the first son of Queen Marika, but after using him for her crusade, she ended up abandoning him, and he's been in the Lands of Shadow ever since. Overall, Mesmer is an amazing boss fight, and it makes me really happy that at least one of the new bosses from Shadow of the Erdtree made it all the way up to S tier. Now at second place we have Ishin the motherfucking Glock Saint. Not to be confused with Ishin Ashina. Ishin was originally my favorite boss fight in the entire series until I fought another boss recently. Now, what makes Ishin so good is because of the beautiful open field arena, his design which is simple but badass, and it definitely gives off Sword Saint, his movement which is graceful but swift and deadly, his cutscene, and most importantly, the fight itself. Remember when I said that most of the fights in Sekiro felt like a dance? Ishin the Sword Saint is the perfect example of this, and yes, I did say the perfect example. I remember when I used to fight him every day back in 2021 because of how good and addictive the fight is. It's like playing a rhythm game. Remember when I said Genichiro uses everything that the player learned to test them on their skills? The thing is, Ishin takes that and dials it all the way up to 11 and makes it look way cooler. Now let's talk about the phases, starting with phase 1. This phase is the second easiest out of all three because it's mostly focused on his katana. The second phase, which is the hardest, is when he pulls out a giant spear out of the ground. The spear attacks are really deadly as it does a lot of damage, and now he uses his gun, hence why I call him the Glock Saint. I still find it funny how in the game that takes place a long ass time ago, this man Ishin for some reason have a semi-automatic pistol. But then again, this is the same game where you can redirect lightning by just jumping into the air, and there's also just a giant snake just roaming around for some reason. His bullets are easy to deflect if you spam R1. He also shoots out some wind attacks as well. His final phase is the easiest because all you gotta do is redirect his lightning attacks to deal damage. Overall, this fight is amazing and cinematic, and that's why Ishin the Sword Saint is my second favorite Souls boss of all time. And finally, the moment we've all been waiting for, the number one spot. Who is the best Soulsborne boss in history? Out of all the hundreds, who has the most aura? Well, it's simple. Drum rolls please. It's Covetous Demon. I mean, bro is literally the best boss in the entire series. His moveset is fantastic, his lore is great, and the visual design is phenomenal. But yeah, I'm just fucking with you. It's Slave Knight Gale. To be honest, the number one spot was so difficult to rank because it was either between Gale or Ishin, and after fighting both of them over and over, I chose to give Gale the spot. But Ishin still comes extremely close behind him. For example, if I was to rank them out of 100, Gale would get a 99.5 while Ishin would get a 99.3 or something. And the reason why Gale ranks higher is due to a personal preference. Both of them gives off the same vibe when it comes on to being final bosses, but in different ways. While Ishin is more rhythmic, forcing you to get good at deflecting and countering some attacks, he feels a bit safer if you know what I mean, while fighting Gale feels a bit less handholdy and more dangerous, even on subsequent playthroughs. No, I'm not saying that Ishin is easy because he's far from that, but on subsequent playthroughs, even though he still provides a good challenge, he feels a bit safer due to the deflecting mechanic. All in all, both of them provides the same amount of enjoyment and fun, but in different combat styles. Out of all the bosses in Sekiro, Ishin complements the combat style in that game the most, while Gale complements the traditional Soul style of combat, where it's more focused on dodging and timing your attacks properly. And while I really love Sekiro's combat style, due to the different build options you can try on Gale, he gets the number one spot. Now all that aside, let's talk about his boss fight. Gale is the most Soulsborne boss if you know what I mean, and I think more upcoming Souls boss should take on this approach but innovate it even more. The fight itself is really fun and engaging, and I remember dying quite a few times to him on my recent playthrough, and none of those attempts felt miserable or unbearable. To be honest, I had a harder and more miserable time with Frida compared to Gale, and the reason being is because Gale is balanced but challenging at the same time, and he doesn't overstay his welcome either. He's super fast and agile and has a lot of chained attacks, but it's balanced in a way where they are somewhat easy to dodge. But to counteract this, he has a massive health pool, the 5th largest in the game to be exact. His health is almost the same as Midir's, which is crazy, but compared to Midir's fight, this one goes by a lot quicker. Someone on Reddit described Gale feeling different from most bosses because he felt more like a brawl compared to all the other bosses, and this is so true. When you're fighting Gale, it's just cinematic as hell. Most of the times you will both trade attacks, and seeing both the player dodging some of Gale's attacks and watching him dash around the arena makes it feel like you're watching a movie, but you're playing it. His second phase is where things gets crazy, as there are lightning strikes that can kill the player if they aren't paying attention, and now Gale has additional attacks in his moveset. First is this weird burst of numerous red skulls, and now he can throw destructor discs like Krillin. He's also much more aggressive as he has some chains of attacks that requires proper dodge timing. But what really makes the second phase a bit more challenging is the fact that his cape can damage you as well, and to be honest, I've died more times to the cape than I would like to admit. But a really underrated part of the boss fight is how big and open his arena is. I mean, it's only fair that the arena is this big, because imagine having to deal with this in a small room like Dragon Riders. And even though the arena is big, it still requires careful positioning due to the lightning strikes that can appear in random parts of it. And the scenery looks fantastic as well. As you can see, the whole world is turned to ash, which really gives off end of the world vibes. Gameplay aside, the lore behind Gale is so interesting. He went from one of Gwyn's slave knights to a friendly NPC in the main game to helping us fight against Frida to now making it to the literal end of the world, transformed into this dark soul eating being. It's really good, plus he literally said the name of the game, like come on, that definitely gives off final boss energy. But enough glazing, as I don't want to go on and on about how great he is. But let's be honest here, there's barely any flaws in his boss fight. There's no unfair dogshit attack that's hard to dodge. He has some crazy chain attacks, but they're also not hard to dodge. And he doesn't just have a small split second of opening. He also doesn't trick the player by baiting them either. He's just a fair one-on-one duel that doesn't have any bullshit gimmick to it. And that's why I placed him at the #1 spot for the best boss in Soulsborne history. And there you have it, all Soulsborne bosses ranked from worst to best. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, as it did take me a while to make. If you did like it, drop a like and subscribe to the channel, and also check out my Patreon. By subscribing to the Patreon, you can get videos early, personally request a certain video you'd like me to make, and you also get some additional channel benefits. And speaking of Patreon, shout out to my Patreon members, Jabroni Jones, Frank Holos, and Hugh Nguyen. So yeah, thank you for sticking to the end of the video, and I hope you guys have a good one.